Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Silent Footsteps in the Night. I never thought something like this could happen in my own neighborhood. Growing up in a small town, I'd always felt safe, the kind of safety that comes from knowing your neighbors by name and watching your kids play outside until the streetlights flicker on. But that summer, everything changed. Looking back now, I can see the subtle signs I missed, the strange cars that showed up and left again, the quiet tension in the air, the way people stopped saying hello. I just didn't realize how bad it was going to get. It started in late June, the sort of sticky heat that makes you drag your feet and check your phone every 5 minutes hoping for a breeze or a text from someone, anyone, to break the monotony. I was working nights at the grocery store, which was left over from an old chain that had gone under a few years before. The place was half empty, with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint on the walls. On slow nights, I'd stack cans or clean up the aisles while thinking about the coming weekend. That's when the first of the strange things began. It was just after midnight when a man walked in. I hadn't seen him before, which was unusual because the store didn't get many late-night customers. He was tall, around 6 feet, with a thin face and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, like he hadn't washed or changed in days. He didn't say a word, just moved slowly down the aisle, looking at the shelves but not picking anything up. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine but couldn't help glancing over every few seconds. When he finally came to the checkout, I noticed his hands were shaking like he was cold, but it was July and the air conditioning was blasting. I asked if he was okay. He muttered a barely audible "yeah" and paid for a bottle of water with crumpled bills. Before walking out, he looked me directly in the eye and said, "You should be careful." The words hit me weird. I laughed it off, thinking maybe he was just paranoid or messing with me. But when I told my coworkers the next day, they got quiet and looked at each other. One of them, Steve, said he'd seen the same guy hanging around the old park across the street, looking at houses like he was casing them. I shrugged it off again, telling myself he was probably just a homeless guy or someone passing through. But then the break-ins started. First, it was minor stuff: a mailbox pried open, a window screen torn. No one reported anything stolen, just the feeling that someone had been inside. People began locking their doors during the day, something that hadn't been necessary in years. The neighborhood watch started up again after being dormant for over a decade. I joined reluctantly, mostly because my parents insisted it was a good way to keep an eye out. One night, about 2 weeks after that man's visit to the store, I was on patrol with a group of neighbors. We walked the block slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices hushed. That's when we saw a figure standing by an alley, half hidden behind a dumpster. He was watching us, but when we called out, he didn't run. Instead, he smiled a cold, empty smile and walked away without saying a word. The police said they had no suspects and that we should just be vigilant. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I started noticing things I hadn't before: a car parked down the street for hours with no one inside, footsteps on my porch when I was sure I'd locked the door, the sound of glass breaking in the distance at night. One morning, I woke up to find muddy footprints on my kitchen floor. Not small ones, either, large, and smeared across the linoleum like whoever left them was in a hurry. Nothing was missing, but I didn't care. It was the fact that someone had been inside my house without permission. My parents told me to call the police, but when I did, the dispatcher sounded bored and told me to make sure all my doors were locked. It wasn't just my house. Reports of late-night prowlers were coming in from all over town. A woman down the street had been attacked in her backyard, though she managed to fight off her assailant and run inside to lock the door. The police increased patrols, but that only seemed to make things worse. I remember one night hearing sirens scream past my window and seeing neighbors huddled together, whispering, afraid to be alone. I started carrying a baseball bat everywhere, just in case. I told myself I was prepared, but when it came down to it, I froze the first time someone knocked on my door late at night. I didn't open it. I didn't answer. I just sat there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for the knock to stop. That's when I really understood the difference between fear and terror. Fear is something you can face. Terror is paralyzing. It's knowing that something bad is happening right outside your door, and you don't know if you'll be next. It wasn't until a week later, when my best friend Mark disappeared, that everything spiraled out of control. Mark had always been the kind of guy who laughed off danger, the one who told me to chill out and stop worrying so much. But when he didn't show up for work, and his phone went straight to voicemail, I started to panic. We all did. The police searched his apartment but found no sign of forced entry or struggle. It was like he vanished into thin air. No ransom notes, no calls, nothing. Just gone. That night, I sat on my porch, clutching the bat, wondering who was next, wondering if I could trust anyone anymore. The neighborhood had changed, and with it, the sense of safety I'd taken for granted. I didn't know it then, but that summer was just the beginning of a nightmare none of us could have imagined. And it all started with a stranger's warning, you should be careful. The morning after Mark disappeared, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. People moved slower, voices softer, and the usual hum of daily life seemed to have been replaced by an uneasy silence. I woke up early, the sunlight barely filtering through the thin curtains, and sat on the edge of my bed staring at my phone. No messages from Mark, no missed calls, nothing. His name sat there on the screen like a question I didn't want to answer. I got ready for work mechanically, my hands trembling slightly as I tied my shoes. The bat was propped against the wall by the door, a silent reminder of everything that had happened. On my way out, I noticed the muddy footprints on the kitchen floor again. They hadn't been cleaned up, no one had come near the kitchen since the night they appeared. I felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. Whoever had been in my house hadn't just been there to scare me. They knew exactly where to go. When I arrived at the store, the usual flickering lights felt harsher somehow, casting longer shadows down the aisles. Steve was already there, looking more tired than usual. He gave me a quick nod but didn't say much. The conversation was awkward, like we were both waiting for someone else to break the silence. Any news on Mark? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Steve shook his head. Nope. Still a missing person case. Police are running tips, but nothing solid. Gotta be something off about this whole thing. People don't just vanish. I nodded, but inside, I was thinking the same thing. Mark wasn't the type to just disappear. Not without a word, not without leaving something behind. I tried to push the fear down, focusing on stacking cans and wiping shelves, but it kept creeping back every time I heard a noise, the clang of a dropped item, the hum of the freezer, even my own breath. That afternoon, I walked home through the neighborhood, the summer heat clinging to my skin, making me sweat under the weight of my backpack. The normally vibrant green lawns looked wilted, like everything was holding back, waiting. I noticed the same strange car from a few nights before parked at the end of the street, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. No one was inside. I'd never seen that car before, and once again, it didn't move for hours. At the corner, Mrs. Jensen was watering her garden, but she didn't smile or wave like she usually did. Instead, she just stared at me with eyes that looked tired and scared. I forced a weak smile and nodded. The neighborhood had lost more than just Mark, it had lost its innocence. That night, I joined the neighborhood watch meeting at the community center. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who once shared block parties and barbecues, now sitting stiffly in folding chairs, clutching coffee cups like lifelines. The sheriff was there, a middle-aged man with a graying beard and eyes that looked too tired for this town. He started with the usual reassurances, increased patrols, extra officers on foot, and a promise to catch whoever was behind the break-ins and disappearances. But no one seemed reassured. The sheriff's words felt like empty noise against a backdrop of fear. After the meeting, I stayed behind with a few others, Steve, Mrs. Jensen, and a couple of younger guys who'd started carrying baseball bats and pepper spray like we did. We talked quietly, trading stories of strange noises, missing pets, and the feeling of being watched. It was in those hushed conversations that I realized something else had changed. People were pointing fingers, blaming outsiders, talking about strangers and drifters as if they were the cause. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't just random people passing through. It was someone local. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow, sent my heart racing. I kept the bat by my bed, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Around 2 a.m, I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound, like someone testing if I was awake. I wanted to call the police, but I was afraid they'd tell me to lock my doors again and wait it out. Instead, I grabbed the bat and crept toward the window, peeking up through the thin curtain. Nothing. Just the empty street, the shadows of trees swaying gently. I stayed there for a long time, gripping the bat so tightly it hurt, willing myself not to look away. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. It was just a folded piece of paper, no handwriting, printed letters cut out from a magazine. "You're next." My hand shook as I read it over and over. I wanted to burn it, throw it away, pretend it never existed, but part of me knew it was a message. Whoever was doing this wasn't just after Mark, they were after all of us, and they wanted us to know it. The police didn't take the note seriously. They said it could be a prank, that I was under a lot of stress. But I knew better. This was a game to whoever was behind it, a sick, twisted game where we were the prey. I avoided the store that night, not trusting myself to be alone under those flickering lights. Instead, I met up with Steve and a couple of other watch members. We decided to patrol the block together, flashlights in hand, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The summer air was thick, heavy with the smell of grass and pavement, but it couldn't drown out the tension in the silence. As we walked, Steve told me he'd talked to a few other neighbors who'd experienced break-ins, but all of them had been too scared to report it. The pattern was clear. Whoever it was picking people off one by one, testing boundaries, pushing us to the edge. Halfway through the patrol, I noticed movement across the street near the park, the same place the strange man had been spotted before. A figure was crouched near the playground equipment, and for a moment, I thought it might be a kid out late. But then the figure stood up, tall and thin, and disappeared into the shadows before we could get closer. We called out, but there was no answer. When we got back to my house, I saw fresh muddy footprints on the porch steps, smeared into the wood as if someone had just hurried away. The bat felt heavier in my hand, the weight of all the fear and uncertainty pressing down on me. That night, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. We were no longer safe. Not in our homes, not in our neighborhood, not even in the daylight. The person, whoever they were, was in control. And all we could do was try not to be next. The daylight didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The sun burned away shadows, but it couldn't erase what had settled over the neighborhood, an unshakable tension, a constant feeling that eyes were watching, waiting. I found myself jumping at every sound, the rustle of leaves, a car door closing, even my own footsteps on the cracked sidewalk. That morning, I woke up to the dull ache in my shoulders from gripping the bat too tightly the night before. I barely slept, my mind running over the events like a broken record. The note under the door, the footprints on the porch, the shadow near the playground, it was all too real. I knew I couldn't just wait for the next move. I shoved the bat into the back of my closet and tried to act normal. I had to get out of the house, away from the walls that felt like they were closing in. I told myself I'd keep my phone close, check in with Steve, maybe even call the police again if things escalated. But deep down, I doubted any help would come fast enough. At the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed in that same unsettling way, and Steve was there, looking even more worn down than before. He caught my eye and gave me a curt nod, but I could see the worry buried beneath his tired expression. "We need to talk," he said quietly, motioning toward the back room. As we stepped away from the customers and the of the aisles, I noticed how the air felt heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. "Something happened last night," Steve said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and smoothing it out on the counter. "I wasn't going to say anything yet, but I think you should know." I leaned in, heart pounding. The paper was a rough map of the neighborhood, scrawled with notes and markings. One corner was circled in red, the park where we'd seen the figure. "There's been a pattern to the break-ins and disappearances," Steve explained. I started connecting the dots. "It's not random. Whoever this is, they're moving in a loop around the neighborhood, hitting houses in a certain order." "Why?" I asked, voice barely audible. Steve shrugged. "Control, maybe. Or intimidation. They want us scared, but also confused. Like pawns on a board." We talked for a long time, going over the map and trying to figure out who could be behind it. Everyone had theories, but no answers. The sheriff's patrols hadn't caught a thing. Even the neighborhood watch wasn't enough to deter whoever was out there. Later that afternoon, I decided to check on Mrs. Jensen. The way she'd looked at me the other day, tired and scared, it stuck with me. Maybe talking with her would help, or at least make me feel less alone. Her house was quiet when I knocked, the garden wilted in the heat. She opened the door slowly, her eyes red-rimmed and wary. "Hi, Mrs. Jensen," I said, forcing a smile. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. The inside of the house was dark and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. She motioned me to the living room, where we sat on opposite ends of a threadbare couch. "I don't know what's happening to this neighborhood," she said quietly. "But I'm scared. I can't sleep, and every noise makes me jump." I nodded. "Me too. I found a note last night, threatening. The police don't seem to care, but I know it's real." Mrs. Jensen looked at me sharply. "You know, I heard something a few nights ago. Strange noises near my back door. I thought it was an animal, but it wasn't. Did you tell the police?" I asked. She shook her head. "What good would it do? They think we're overreacting. Maybe they're right to some extent, but I don't want to wait until something worse happens." We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "I'm thinking about installing extra locks, maybe even cameras. I don't want to be next." I felt a flicker of hope that maybe we could fight back, that we weren't completely helpless. That evening, I met up with Steve and a few others from the watch group. We decided to split up and patrol different sections, covering more ground. The plan was to check in every 15 minutes and stick to well-lit areas. I took the block around my house, the street lamps casting long pools of light on the cracked pavement. The bat was in my backpack, but I kept my phone in my hand, fingers twitching over the screen, ready to call for help. As I walked, I noticed movement again, this time near the alley behind the grocery store. A shadow detached itself from the darkness and moved quickly across the street. I called out, voice shaking. No answer. I started to follow, heart racing, but the figure melted into the night before I could get close. I cursed silently, frustration burning through me. Whoever it was, they were good at disappearing. I checked my phone and saw Steve's message, all clear on my end. You? I typed back, saw something near the alley. No idea who. Minutes later, Steve replied, stay safe. Don't go alone. I took a deep breath and doubled back toward my house, eyes darting to every shadow. When I got to the porch, I saw fresh footprints again, this time muddy and smeared across the welcome mat. They led to the side gate and then disappeared. My hands trembled as I locked the door behind me. The bat was back in my grip, heavier than ever. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the front window, waiting for something that might never come. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating, but I couldn't let it win. As the night deepened, I realized that this wasn't just about missing people or broken locks. It was about fear that someone we knew, someone who lived among us, could be capable of this. The thought was worse than anything else. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, held hostage by the darkness in our own backyard. And no one knew when it would end. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every creak in the house sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a whisper meant just for me. I kept the bat beside the bed, my hand resting on the handle, ready to grab it if I needed to. But the hours dragged on in silence, and I was left alone with my thoughts' dangerous territory. By dawn, I was exhausted but restless. The neighborhood was still shrouded in an uneasy quietness, like the world had paused just to watch us. I knew I couldn't stay holed up inside forever. Steve was right. We needed eyes on the street, and I needed to do my part. But I also knew I had to be smarter, more careful. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a presence, calculating and patient. I texted Steve first thing, we need a better plan. Someone's out there, watching. We can't just keep running in the dark. His reply was quick, meeting tonight. Same place. Bring anyone you trust. That sent a shiver down my spine. Trust was the rarest commodity these days. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension. I made sure the windows and doors were locked tight, and I asked Mrs. Jensen to let me know if she spotted anything suspicious. She promised, but the look in her eyes made me doubt she'd get any real rest either. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, something to clear my head, though I didn't expect much peace. The cracked sidewalks were familiar, but the way I looked at them had shifted. Every porch, every shadowed doorway felt like a trap, every parked car a possible hiding spot. As I passed the park, I noticed something odd. The red circle on Steve's map, the playground where we'd seen the figure before, had fresh signs of disturbance. The sandbox was raked smooth, like someone had tried to erase footprints, but the edges were messy. I crouched down and spotted a few tiny shards of glass scattered near the swing set. I picked one up carefully, no idea what it was doing there, but it didn't belong. Maybe a bottle smashed during a scuffle, or something dropped in a hurry. I stuffed it into my pocket and stood up, feeling the weight of it like a silent accusation. I kept walking, eyes sharp, heartbeat steady but loud in my ears. At the corner, I saw a group gathered outside the old community center, Steve and a few others from the watch group. People I trusted, or maybe just hoped I could. We talked in hushed voices, sharing what we'd seen and heard. The stories weren't comforting. Broken locks, late-night prowlers, even a couple of cars keyed in broad daylight. The fear wasn't just at night anymore, it had bled into our days. Steve pulled out the map again, now covered in more notes and circles. We think they're trying to isolate us, he said. Cut off the routes we used to check on each other, keep us scared and divided. I nodded grimly. So what's the plan? We can't just wait for them to make the next move. We increased patrols, Steve said. But smarter this time. We use pairs, cover the blind spots, and keep phones on us at all times. No one goes out alone after dark. It was a start. Not perfect, but better than nothing. As the meeting wrapped up, I noticed a new face, a man standing a little apart from the group, arms crossed, watching us with a hard expression. I didn't recognize him, and the feeling in my gut was immediate and sour. Before I could ask, Steve introduced him. This is Mark. He just moved in a few weeks ago. Heard about the situation and wanted to help. Mark nodded curtly but didn't speak much. I tried to shake off the discomfort, telling myself it was just nerves. That night, we split up into pairs like we agreed. I was with Lisa, a nurse from down the street who'd seen too many things to be easily scared. We patrolled the stretch near the park where the broken glass had been, keeping close and scanning every shadow. About an hour into our walk, Lisa stopped suddenly, her hand on my arm. Did you hear that? I strained my ears. At first, just the usual sounds, the distant barking of a dog, leaves rustling, but then, a faint click. Metal against metal. From the alley beside the grocery store. We exchanged a glance and moved carefully toward the sound. The alley was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallowed the weak glow of the streetlights. Stay close, I whispered, heart hammering. We edged forward, and then I saw it, a small, glinting object lying near the dumpster. A lockpick set. Lisa's eyes widened. They're getting bolder. Suddenly, a noise from the far end of the alley made us freeze, a soft shuffle, like someone stepping over gravel. I gripped the bat tighter, and Lisa pulled out her phone, ready to call for backup. Who's there? I called, voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. No answer. The footsteps quickened, and a figure darted out from the shadows, moving fast and low. We tried to follow, but they vanished around the corner before we could see a face. Lisa was shaking. That was too close. We hurried back to the main street, breath coming in short bursts. I sent a text to Steve, someone in the alley. Lockpicks found. We need help. His reply was almost immediate, back up on the way. Stay put. Minutes later, the neighborhood watch arrived, flashlights cutting through the dark. We scoured the area but found no sign of the figure. The lockpicks were collected as evidence, but the message was clear. Whoever this was, they wanted to send us a warning. They were watching, testing our defenses, and learning our patterns. Back home, I sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted but wired. The bat lay nearby, but now it felt heavier, like a symbol of the burden we all carried. I thought about Mrs. Jensen, alone in her dark house, and about the others in the neighborhood, trapped in this invisible siege. And then my phone buzzed, an anonymous message this time. You're starting to notice. Good. Keep looking. I stared at the screen, the weight of those words pressing down on me. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and we were all pieces on their board. But I wasn't about to let myself be a pawn any longer. Tomorrow, I decided, I would try to find out who was behind this. No more waiting. No more hiding. Because if we didn't fight back, no one else would. And in the end, that's what fear was really about, not the darkness outside, but the darkness in the people around us. The ones who knew exactly how to use it. We were fighting not just to survive, but to take back our lives. And that night, as the house finally settled into silence, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't be next. The next day was a blur of restless energy and uneasy vigilance. I kept replaying the night's encounter, the lockpicks, the shadowy figure darting away, that anonymous message burned into my phone screen. You're starting to notice. Good. Keep looking. It was a challenge, and I couldn't ignore it. I met Steve at the same coffee shop where we huddled a few times before. It was a place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee, but it felt like neutral ground. We needed to talk strategy without the weight of the neighborhood's eyes. Steve looked more worn than usual, dark circles under his eyes, his hands twitching as he stirred his black coffee. "You okay?" I asked. "Could be better," he admitted. "It's like whoever this is, they're testing every weak spot in our defenses. And they're patient. Patient and smart." We mapped out what we had so far: broken locks, late-night prowlers, that strange incident in the alley. Each event felt random but was probably part of a bigger picture. "We have to think like them," Steve said. "Anticipate the next move before they make it." I nodded, though my stomach twisted with the realization that we were up against someone or some group who knew our routines, who could wait hours in the dark without blinking. After the meeting, I went back home and started going through the photos I'd taken of the neighborhood over the past week. I was looking for anything unusual, anything that might have slipped past us. As I scrolled, my phone rang. It was Lisa. "Hey," she said, voice low. "Hey," I replied. "I wanted to tell you something. Last night, when we found the lockpicks, I remembered something." Her breath was quick, like she was trying to decide if she should say it. "What is it?" "There was a break-in at the grocery store a few weeks ago. Not reported to the cops, but the owner mentioned it to me when I was buying supplies. The door lock was messed with, but nothing was stolen. Just a warning, maybe." That hit me hard. Whoever was behind all this wasn't just some random troublemaker. They had a message to send and territory to stake out. That evening, I went on the patrol with Lisa again, both of us on edge. We covered the same area near the park, eyes darting toward every shadow. The cracked sidewalks, the flickering streetlights, the rustling leaves all felt like clues in a puzzle we hadn't solved yet. Midway through, my phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message: "Look closer. You're missing the pattern." I showed Lisa. She frowned. "Pattern? What pattern?" "We're going to find out," I said. We decided to split up briefly, still close enough to call for backup if needed, but covering more ground. I took the path toward the east end of the neighborhood, near the old train tracks. It was a route almost no one used after dark, a forgotten stretch lined with overgrown bushes and rusted fences. As I walked, my breath visible in the cold air, I noticed something strange. A series of scratches on the fence posts, too deliberate to be random. They looked like marks, almost like a code. I crouched down, tracing the lines with my fingers. It was subtle, but consistent. Someone had been here, marking something. My phone buzzed again. "You're getting warmer." The message sent a shiver down my spine, but I also felt a spark of determination. Whoever this was, they wanted to be found. Or maybe they wanted to control how and when. I headed back to Lisa, and we shared what we'd seen. Together, we speculated on what the marks could mean: territory boundaries, signals, or warnings to others. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, bat in hand, listening for any sound. The town felt different now, less a home and more a cage. That's when the knock came. It was soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. No one. Just the empty porch, shadows stretching under the dim streetlight. I opened the door a crack, heart racing. On the welcome mat was a small envelope, plain and unmarked. I picked it up, hands shaking. Inside was a folded map, hand-drawn, with the neighborhood sketched out. Circles and lines, some matching the marks I'd seen on the fence. And in the center, a bold red X over my own house. On the back, a note in neat, cold handwriting. "We're closer than you think." I slammed the door shut and locked it twice. My phone buzzed immediately. "Got something?" Steve's text. I sent him a picture of the map and the note. His reply, "Meet me now. Don't come alone." I grabbed the bat, slipped on my jacket, and headed out. Every step felt heavier, the night pressing down on me like a weight. At the meeting spot, a small clearing behind the community center, Steve was waiting, along with Mark, the new guy from the watch group. "Look what I got," I said, showing them the map. Mark's face went pale, but he said nothing. Steve studied it for a moment, then looked up. "This is serious. Whoever's doing this knows exactly where we live, and they want us rattled. And they're not stopping," I added. "Last night, the lockpicks. Now this." Mark finally spoke, voice low. "I think it's someone local. Someone who knows the neighborhood well. Maybe someone who's angry or feels wronged." Steve nodded. "That's what worries me the most. This isn't random. It's targeted. Personal." We talked late into the night, making plans to increase patrols, check on neighbors more often, and report any strange activity immediately. We agreed to keep the map between us for now. We didn't want to spread panic, but we had to be ready. On the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound, every flicker of movement caught my attention. The house was supposed to be my sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap. That night, I double-checked every lock, every window, and set my phone alarm to alert me to any noise. I lay awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the next move. Because this wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about survival. And I wasn't about to let whoever was behind this win. Story 2, Deadly Likes, the Viral Dare. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who looked back and wished I'd walked away sooner. I always believed I had a strong sense of judgment, a sixth sense for when something or someone was off. But that night, in that cramped apartment on 7th Street, all my instincts either failed me or I chose to ignore them. Maybe both. Looking back, I see how a chain of small, almost meaningless decisions led me into something I wouldn't forget, though I wanted to. It all began with a text message, a simple, casual invitation that felt like an opportunity one couldn't pass up. My roommate, Alex, had dropped out of town for a family emergency, and the apartment felt emptier than usual. I was tired of eating alone and scrolling through my phone, hoping for a distraction. Then, there was a ping from an old acquaintance, Mark. Mark and I had worked together for a few months at a local coffee shop about a year ago. We weren't friends, exactly, but we talked enough to remember each other. He wasn't someone I'd ever go out of my way to hang with, but when he texted me that evening, his message was casual, easygoing. "Hey, want to come by my place?" Just a few people, nothing wild. "Kind of bored here." It wasn't unusual, and honestly, I was bored too. I hesitated, though. There was a flicker of hesitation that I shoved aside. Mark had a reputation not for violence or anything dramatic, but for being unreliable and a bit reckless. He'd been fired from the coffee shop for showing up late repeatedly and had a tendency to drink more than he could handle. But I told myself that this was different. Maybe he'd changed. Maybe it would just be a quiet night. I texted back, "Sure, I'll come over in about an hour." I grabbed a bottle of cheap wine at the corner store on my way, thinking it would be a polite gesture to bring something. That, too, was a decision I would reconsider later. By the time I arrived, it was just past 8. The building was older, one of those creaky brick structures where you could hear the neighbors through the walls. I climbed the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor and paused outside Mark's door, wondering what to expect. The faint sound of laughter and music seeped through the cracked door. I knocked lightly. "Hey, come on in," Mark called from inside. The apartment smelled of stale smoke and something metallic like the faint, sharp scent of spilled beer mixed with sweat. The living room was dimly lit, cluttered with empty cans and fast food wrappers. A group of 4 people were sprawled on battered couches and chairs, all in various stages of intoxication and boredom. I recognized a couple of them vaguely from the neighborhood, but no one who looked like an old friend. Mark waved me over and handed me a plastic cup filled with something amber-colored. "Here, this is from my stash," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I took the cup, and we exchanged a few uneventful words about work and the weather. The others barely acknowledged me, absorbed in their own conversations and phones. At first, the night felt like any other dull gathering, people half-heartedly trying to have fun, the kind of low-energy hangout you show up to when you don't have anywhere better to be. But as the hours stretched on, the atmosphere shifted. Mark started to drink more heavily, his mood swinging between jovial and irritable. He kept making these cutting jokes, some of which were directed at one of the women there, a quiet girl named Sarah, who barely spoke and kept to herself. I noticed Mark's eyes lingered on her a little too long, and his tone grew sharper when he addressed her. A few times, Sarah tried to leave, but Mark insisted she stay, his voice raising just enough to be uncomfortable. I felt a knot in my stomach but didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she could handle herself. Then there was the moment when Mark stumbled near the kitchen, spilling a drink on the floor. I went over to help him mop it up, and he grabbed my arm too hard. "Relax," he said, laughing, but there was an edge to his voice that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off and stepped back. It wasn't until later, when the others had started to drift off or pass out, that things got worse. Sarah was standing by the window, looking out into the night. Mark approached her again, and this time I could see her trying to step away from him. He grabbed her wrist roughly. "Hey, that's enough," I said, stepping between them. Mark turned to me, eyes bloodshot, voice slurred. "None of your business." The way he said it, so low and dangerous, made my skin crawl. I could feel the tension in the room spike. Sarah jerked free and headed toward the door. "Going somewhere?" Mark's voice followed her, but she didn't look back. I wanted to say something more, to step in, but I was frozen, caught between wanting to leave and the hope that nothing else would happen. That's when Mark's anger fully broke loose. He turned back to me and grabbed the armrest of the chair so hard it cracked. "You think you're better than me? Just because you got a job and a place to live?" I didn't answer. My mouth felt dry. He took a step forward. I realized then that I had to make a choice, stay and risk whatever was coming next or get out. I said quietly, "I'm going to go." Mark's face twisted, then he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Yeah, go ahead. No one's stopping you." I didn't wait for an invitation. I grabbed my jacket and left, the cold night air hitting me like a wall as soon as I stepped outside the building. I walked fast, not looking back. But even as I put distance between myself and that apartment, I felt like something had changed inside me. The sense of safety I took for granted was gone, replaced with a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. That night was the first time I realized how fragile the line was between normal and something else entirely, something dangerous, something human, and yet utterly terrifying. And I didn't know then that it was only the beginning. I spent the next morning replaying everything over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. The night hadn't been wild or chaotic in any way that screamed danger right away. There were no punches thrown, no shouts that carried through the streets, no sirens wailing in the distance. But the way Mark looked at Sarah, the way he grabbed her wrist, and then how he turned on me, it all lingered like a dark cloud that refused to lift. It was the kind of fear that settled quietly, the kind you don't always spot until it's too late. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window into the pale gray morning, when my phone buzzed. I glanced down without much hope and saw Mark's name flashing on the screen. I didn't answer. I thought about deleting the message, but my thumb hovered over the screen. It was just a text. "Look, I didn't mean to get like that last night. Sorry if I made you uncomfortable." I stared at it for a long time before I finally typed back, "It's okay. Just don't let it happen again." I didn't expect a reply, and none came. But I still felt unsettled enough that I didn't want to see anyone else, didn't want to leave my apartment or run into those faces again. I told myself I needed to calm down, that Mark was just drunk and stressed. People acted like that sometimes. But it didn't feel right. That unease clung to me all day, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I kept checking my phone for another message or a call from Sarah, hoping she was okay, but she never reached out. I even considered texting her myself, but something stopped me. It was none of my business, I told myself again. I wasn't going to get involved. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, the way they had darted around the room that night, how she barely spoke, how she tried to slip away more than once. There was something in her silence that screamed for help, even though she never said a word. That afternoon, I decided to run some errands to clear my head. The streets were congested with the usual afternoon rush, and the noise from cars and chatter of strangers felt overwhelming. I walked slower than usual, dragging my feet, my mind circling back to last night's tension. On impulse, I stopped by the coffee shop where Mark and I had worked together. It was quiet, the small space smelling faintly of espresso and cinnamon. I figured maybe seeing something familiar would ground me. The barista behind the counter barely glanced up as I ordered a black coffee. As I sipped, I noticed one of my old coworkers, Jenna, restocking some pastries. I hadn't seen her in months. I thought maybe it was time to reach out. Anyone who knew Mark might have some insight into what I'd witnessed. "Hey, Jenna," I said, approaching her as she wiped down the counter. She looked up, surprised but friendly. "Hey. Long time no see. How've you been?" "Okay. Listen, do you know anything about Mark? Like, how he's been lately?" Her face tightened. "Mark? He's been kind of a mess, to be honest. Drinking a lot more than before. Getting into fights here and there. The last few weeks, he's been off." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Did he ever get violent?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not exactly violent, but he's definitely pushed people around. Sarah, yeah, she's been on edge around him for a while. She quit working here a couple weeks ago." The name struck a nerve. Sarah quit. "Why?" Jenna sighed. She didn't say much, just that she needed to get out. Mark made things uncomfortable. Some of the girls were worried. I thanked her and left the shop, my stomach twisting into knots. That evening, I found myself walking back towards 7th Street, the scene of the night before. The buildings looked the same, weathered and tired, but something about the street felt heavier now, like a low hum of tension vibrating just beneath the surface. I stood across the street from Mark's building, watching the windows glow faintly in the dusk. I wasn't sure what I was looking for or hoping to find. Closure? Confirmation that I wasn't crazy for feeling scared? Maybe just some way to process what I'd seen. As I stood there, a figure appeared at the entrance to the building. It was Sarah. She looked smaller in the fading light, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world. She glanced around nervously before stepping into the street and walking briskly away. I wanted to call out to her, to warn her or ask if she was all right. But I didn't. Instead, I just watched her disappear into the gathering shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and walked home, feeling more alone than I had in a long time. The next few days blurred together. I tried to keep busy, threw myself into work, and avoided Mark's texts and any thought of that night. But the paranoia settled in. Every time my phone buzzed, my hand shook just a little. Every time I walked past a darkened building or heard a footstep behind me, I spun around, heart hammering. And then, without warning, I got a knock on my door late one night. I wasn't expecting anyone. My mind raced as I peeked through the peephole. It was Mark. He didn't look like the guy I remembered from the coffee shop or even from the party. His eyes were bloodshot, but there was something colder there now, a sharpness that didn't belong to the man who'd once just been reckless and careless. I debated ignoring the knock, but something, a morbid curiosity or a misguided sense of responsibility, made me open the door. "Hey," he slurred, stepping inside before I could say no. "We need to talk." I backed up against the wall, suddenly small in the space that once felt like his territory. "What is it?" I asked, voice steady even though my pulse was racing. He laughed, a hollow sound. "You think you can just walk out on me? On us?" "Us?" I repeated, confused. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about last night. It's about everything. About respect. About who's in control." I swallowed hard, realizing I had no idea who this person was anymore. The man standing before me was unhinged, dangerous, and I was trapped in my own home with him. I needed to get him out. I needed to get away. I said calmly, "You should go." But Mark was already moving closer, his breath sour with alcohol, eyes wild. It was the moment I understood that my instincts hadn't failed me the night before. They had been warning me all along. And now, the real danger was here. The door clicked shut behind Mark, and the sound felt deafening in the small apartment. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to read the expression in his bloodshot eyes. There was desperation, yes, but beneath that, something darker, resentment, maybe even rage. I swallowed hard, my mind racing to find a way out of this. "Mark, you need to leave," I said, my voice quieter this time, but still firm. He laughed again, a short, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "You think I'm just gonna walk out? After everything? You think you can just shut me out?" I took a cautious step back, bumping into the kitchen counter. The small knife block sat there, the blades gleaming under the dim light. I told myself not to look at it, but I couldn't help it. My fingers itched for something to hold on to, something that could give me a fighting chance. "Look, I don't want to fight," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you're drunk. You're scaring me." Scared, yes. Shaking, yes. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure he could hear it. But I tried to keep calm, tried to remind myself that this was just Mark, just a man wrecked by anger and alcohol, not some unstoppable force. He lurched forward, and I took another step back, knocking over a chair. It scraped across the floor, a sharp noise that seemed to break the tension for a second. Mark blinked, and I saw a flicker of something, regret, pass over his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You don't get it," he said, voice low and trembling. "You think you're better than me. You think you can walk away from this, like it's nothing. Like you're safe." I shook my head. "I just want you to leave." He moved again, closer this time, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The apartment felt smaller, suffocating, and I realized I hadn't locked the door behind me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Mark's eyes darted toward the front door. "Lock it," he ordered. Lock everything. You're not going anywhere. My breath caught. That wasn't a request. That was a command. And I was trapped. I glanced around, looking for something to defend myself. My phone was on the table, but I couldn't risk turning my back to him. The knife block was closest, but grabbing it would mean moving in his direction. Mark, please, I said, voice shaking. You're drunk. Let's just talk in the morning. He scoffed. Talk? You think talking fixes this? No, you need to learn. You're mine. The words hit me like a punch. I'm not yours. His face twisted in anger. You think you can say that and just walk away? No one walks away from me. Panic surged through me, sharp and cold. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. I needed a plan. Mark took another step forward, and I felt his breath on my face, sour and sharp. I closed my eyes for a brief second, then opened them to catch his wrist as he reached for me. Stop, I said, pulling back hard. He stumbled, surprised. It was the moment I decided to try and push past him, toward the front door. But Mark caught me, gripping my arm tight enough to leave bruises. Where do you think you're going? He hissed. I yanked my arm free and darted past him, reaching for the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Mark lunged, grabbing my jacket, pulling me back. I twisted, breaking free again, and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was both a relief and a torment. I was safe, for now, but he was still inside. Mark pounded on the door, shouting my name, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, trying to steady my breath. Then he started yelling things I didn't understand, threats and promises all jumbled together. My mind was a chaotic mess of fear and disbelief. I grabbed my phone off the table and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. It's an emergency, I whispered into the receiver. There's a man in my apartment, he won't leave. He's drunk and threatening me. The operator's voice was calm, professional. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. Can you lock yourself in a room? Yes, I said, nodding even though no one could see me. I moved toward the bedroom, keeping an eye on the door. Mark was still shouting, hitting the door with his fists, but he didn't try to follow me. I locked the bedroom door and slid down the wall, burying my face in my hands. The sound of sirens in the distance was the first real comfort I'd felt in days. The police arrived within minutes, banging on the front door and shouting commands. Mark's shouting turned to curses and then silence. When the officers entered, I was shaking uncontrollably, but I managed to tell them everything. They handcuffed Mark and let him out, his face a mask of anger and defeat. I stood in the hallway, watching as they put him into the back of a squad car. The reality of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy fog. I was safe for now, but the fear wasn't gone. It had burrowed into my bones, a constant reminder that some dangers didn't come from shadows or monsters. Sometimes they came from the people you thought you knew. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, the apartment feeling vast and empty without Mark's looming presence. I stared at my phone, half expecting it to buzz with another message, but it stayed silent. I thought about Sarah, about Jenna, about all the signs I had missed or ignored. How easy it had been to pretend everything was normal until it wasn't. In the early hours, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a victim. I would get help, talk to someone, maybe even Sarah, if I could find her. I needed to understand why Mark had spiraled like this, and more importantly, how to keep myself safe. The sun rose, casting pale light through the window, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something like hope. Because sometimes, the only way to survive the darkness was to face it head-on. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping insistently against the window. It was one of those dreary early April mornings where the sky was a dull gray smear, and the world outside looked tired before it had even begun. I sat up slowly, the weight of the previous night threatening to pin me down. My muscles ached from the adrenaline crash, and the bruises on my arms throbbed softly as a reminder of how close things had come to turning even darker. I hadn't slept, not really. I dozed off for short stretches, but my mind kept replaying the scene over and over, Mark's bloodshot eyes, the way his voice had cracked, the suffocating feeling of being trapped with someone you once trusted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him there, looming like a storm cloud I couldn't outrun. I didn't want to move. The apartment felt empty in a new way, clean, sterile, and cold. Mark's scent was all but gone, but the lingering tension was still thick in the air. It was as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened, as if they were waiting for the next storm to break. The phone buzzed on the coffee table. I almost didn't want to look at it. When I finally did, my heart sank. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you call the cops? You're making it worse." I froze, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled, and I wanted to throw the phone across the room. But I didn't. Instead, I locked it down and deleted the message. My fingers hesitated before sending a quick, firm reply, "Leave me alone." Of course, I doubted it would stop him. I knew I couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not with the fear clawing at my chest every minute. I called into work, saying I wasn't feeling well. The lies didn't feel like lies anymore. They were necessary shields, walls I'd have to build for a while. The apartment was quiet when the officers left after their report. They told me Mark was being held until his blood alcohol level dropped, and that charges would be filed. But the whole thing felt so distant, like a bad dream I wanted to forget. I knew better now. This wasn't a dream. This was real. After hanging up with 911, I called Sarah. Her voice was warm but cautious when she answered. I could hear the concern behind her words. I spilled the whole story, every detail, every fear. She didn't say much, just listened, which was what I needed most. When I finished, she promised to come over as soon as she could. Waiting for Sarah gave me too much time to think, and the thoughts were poisonous. I questioned every interaction, every moment I'd overlooked. I thought about Jenna and how I'd brushed off her warnings. I thought about the late nights Mark's behavior had grown stranger, how sometimes he was sweet, and other times I barely recognized him. When Sarah arrived, she hugged me tight. I cried into her shoulder, hard and messy. It was the release I didn't know I needed. She sat with me for hours, helping me make calls to a local support group, a counselor. She stayed until I felt less like a trapped animal and more like a person again. Later that day, I packed a small bag. Just essentials, clothes, my laptop, chargers, a few personal things. I told myself it was temporary, just until things settled. But deep down, I knew the apartment felt like a cage now. Staying would only remind me of last night's terror. I went to the front door one more time and looked out through the peephole. The hallway was quiet, empty. The building felt normal, but I knew better. I had to remind myself that danger wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it crept in unfamiliar footsteps. As I slipped out, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that I was leaving, but guilt for abandoning what I once thought was home. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the deadbolt. My fingers shook. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not yet. I needed space to breathe, to figure out what came next without the constant threat hanging over me. For the first time in days, I felt like I had a sliver of control. But the fear wasn't gone. I knew it wouldn't be for a long time. It had embedded itself deep inside, a shadow I carry wherever I went. Later that evening, I sat in a small cafe far from my apartment. The noise of conversations and clinking cups was a strange comfort, a reminder that life kept moving forward even when mine felt frozen. I scrolled through my phone, ignoring the missed calls and texts I wasn't ready to answer. Then, a message popped up from an unknown number again. "You can't hide forever." My stomach twisted. I locked my phone and stuffed it into my bag. No matter how far I ran, some dangers followed. But I wasn't going to let fear win. Not this time. I took a deep breath and looked out the window. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing. A fresh start felt impossible, but maybe that was the point. Maybe survival wasn't about forgetting the darkness, it was about moving through it, step by step. I stood up, heart pounding, and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face, sharp and real. Each footstep echoed my resolve I wouldn't be a shadow in someone else's story. I was writing my own, one breath at a time. I spent the night at Sarah's apartment, the constant hum of the city outside a strange counterpoint to the frailty I felt inside. Her place was small but warm, cluttered with books and succulents, and it smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She made me tea and left the kettle boiling on the stove, something ordinary in a day that felt anything but. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, Mark's face twisted through my mind like a broken movie reel. I kept replaying the texts, the coldness that had crept into his voice just before everything unraveled. Sarah slept on the couch, but I barely noticed. I was too wound up, too raw. When morning came, I told her I needed to go somewhere, anywhere else. I couldn't stay inside, not one more minute. She nodded without hesitation and handed me a small notebook she said might help if I wanted to write things down. I tucked it into my bag even though I wasn't sure I'd use it. I wandered through the city, the streets wet from the rain that had stopped the night before. The air smelled like damp concrete and fresh-cut grass. I walked without a destination, my mind tangled between relief and dread. At one point, I found myself outside Mark's old apartment building. I hadn't been back since I left. The sight of it made my chest tighten. It was just a nondescript block of brick and glass, but I could feel the weight of everything that had happened inside. I didn't want to linger, I turned away almost immediately, but the shadow of it stayed with me. I thought about the police report, about the possibility of pressing charges, getting a restraining order. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I felt the crushing weight of uncertainty. Would the system protect me? Would Mark respect any boundaries? Or was this just the beginning of a longer nightmare? My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and felt my breath catch. Another message from an unknown number. "Thought you'd run." I stared at it, heart hammering, fingers trembling. I wanted to throw the phone, to smash it into a million pieces. But instead, I locked it and shoved it in my pocket, trying to steady my breathing. I sat down on a nearby bench, the cold metal biting through my coat. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, but I forced myself to stay. I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm. "He's messing with you," she said quietly. "You need to be careful." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "I don't know what he wants. Or why this is still happening." "You're not alone," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out." And I believed her. Over the next few days, I tried to keep a routine, but nothing felt normal. I went to the community center Sarah had recommended. The support group was small and quiet, mostly women who spoke gently about their own stories, their own survival. Hearing them, I realized I wasn't the first to be trapped by someone they thought they could trust. One woman, her voice steady and kind, told me, "Fear is a predator's favorite weapon. The best defense is knowing you're not invisible." That stuck with me. I started to write, filling the notebook Sarah gave me. I jotted down dates, feelings, moments I hadn't dared to remember before. It was like shedding a layer of the weight I'd been carrying, the shame, the guilt, the confusion. But even with all the support, the messages didn't stop. Late one night, as I was about to close my eyes, my phone lit up again. "We're not done." The words were simple but heavy. I shut my eyes tight and tried to convince myself it was just someone who wanted to scare me. But deep down, I knew it was Mark. I spent the next days changing my routines, avoiding places I thought he might know, even taking different routes to the grocery store. I told Sarah everything, and she helped me contact a legal advisor who specialized in cases like mine. They talked about protective orders, surveillance cameras, even personal safety alarms. I felt a strange mixture of empowerment and exhaustion. Every step I took to protect myself felt like reclaiming a piece of my life, but it also reminded me how much had been stolen. One afternoon, I walked into the community center to find a man waiting outside. He wore a hoodie pulled low, his hands stuffed into his pockets. My stomach dropped. My mind raced. Was it Mark? Someone else? I considered turning back, but the door was right there, and I needed to get inside. As I approached, the man looked up, his eyes briefly meeting mine. Then he smiled, a cold, empty smile that made my skin crawl. "Hey," he said softly. "You don't have to be scared." I froze, then forced myself to keep moving. I walked past him without a word, heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I didn't look back. Inside, the center was warm and bright, a sanctuary of sorts. I told the staff what had happened. They offered to call someone, to hold me there until I felt safe. I sat down and pulled out my notebook, writing everything I could remember about the man. A description for the police, a record of another threat. The woman from the group sat beside me. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "We're here. You're not alone." For the first time in weeks, I felt a little less invisible. That night, I slept with the lights on, my phone by my side, each message a prompt to stay vigilant. I knew Mark was watching, waiting. But I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I was fighting back. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, calls, and cautious steps. I changed my phone number, tightened my social media settings, and installed a security app that alerted Sarah if I was in trouble. The police followed up, and I filed for a protective order. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was a line in the sand. One evening, as I sat alone in a cafe, my fingers traced the edge of my coffee cup. The weight of everything still pressed down, but the knot in my chest was a little looser. Then my phone buzzed. My heart jumped. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from a friend, Sarah. "Dinner tomorrow? We'll figure this out, together." I smiled, a real, shaky smile. Because in this darkness, I had found a sliver of light. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The apartment was no longer mine. It belonged to memories I didn't want and silence I couldn't escape. But outside, in the messy, unpredictable world, I was starting to take back control. Survival wasn't a straight line, it was jagged and uneven. But I was moving forward, one cautious step at a time. And that made all the difference. Story 3, Midnight Platform No One Boards. I never thought much about the people I passed by every day. Faces blurred into the background, commuters, neighbors, strangers hurrying somewhere else, caught up in their own lives. But that changed the night I met him. It happened 2 weeks ago, near the end of April, when the city still smelled like rain and fresh grass. I worked late at the publishing house downtown, the one with the cracked brick exterior and the faint smell of old paper on every floor. I often stayed past midnight, sifting through manuscripts or answering emails that piled up faster than I could manage during the day. That night, I was finally shutting down my computer around 12:15 a.m. The office was empty except for me and the cleaning crew already mopping the floors near the elevators. I packed my bags slowly, conscious that the subway station 2 blocks away would be closing soon. Outside, the street lamps flickered unevenly as a cold breeze stirred the empty sidewalks. I left the building, locking the door behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than usual in the silence. I wanted to get home, crawl under the covers, and forget the endless work waiting for me tomorrow. As I walked toward the station, my footsteps echoed on wet pavement. The rain had stopped just an hour before, leaving puddles that reflected the dim glow of neon signs from nearby shops. The city felt deserted, but not quite empty. There was a lingering tension in the air, something intangible, like a quiet warning I couldn't place. Near the corner of 5th and Maple, where the deli stays open 24/7, I noticed a man standing under the flickering green awning, smoking a cigarette. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, with a worn leather jacket and scruffy brown hair. His face was partially hidden by the smoke curling upward, but his eyes caught mine as I passed, sharp and unsettling. I tried not to look, quickening my pace. But he fell into step beside me, matching my stride with a casual ease that felt anything but casual. "Long night?" he asked, voice low. I considered ignoring him, but didn't want to start a confrontation. "Just work," I said, trying to sound indifferent. He nodded, taking another drag from his cigarette. "I know the feeling. This city only sleeps when it has to." I glanced over, noting the slight tremor in his hands. "Are you okay?" I asked, surprised by the concern creeping into my voice. He laughed softly, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Just tired." Then he exhaled smoke and gestured toward the subway entrance. "You heading down there?" "Yeah," I said, stepping toward the stairs. He followed me, close enough that I could smell the tobacco and something else, something bitter beneath it. A sour sweat, maybe. On the platform, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The train was late. We stood side by side, the silence stretching between us thick and uncomfortable. He broke it. "You live around here?" "Not far," I said. He nodded again, like he was filing the information away. I kept my eyes on the tracks, watching for the glowing headlights of the train. When it finally pulled into the station, I moved to board quickly, hoping this would be the end of the encounter. But he stepped onto the car behind me, finding a seat directly across the aisle. I sat near the window, pretending to read a book I wasn't really interested in. I felt his gaze on me the whole ride, heavy and persistent. When the train reached my stop, I stood and moved toward the doors. He followed. Outside, the street was quieter still. I noticed fewer people now, the late-night crowd thinning to just a handful of drifters and cab drivers. The man matched my pace again. "Hey," he said, his voice closer this time. "You live alone?" I stiffened, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone flat. "Must get lonely sometimes," he said, smiling. But it was a smile without warmth. I quickened my steps, turning down an alley to shave off some time. He followed. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check a message, fingers trembling. My thumb hovered over the emergency call button. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I don't want any trouble." He stopped a few feet behind me, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Neither do I," he said. "Just thought we could talk." I didn't respond. Instead, I glanced around, hoping to spot anyone. Suddenly, he took a half step forward. "You don't have to be afraid." But I was. I broke into a run. My shoes slapped against the wet concrete as I sprinted toward the main street, heart thundering in my ears. I didn't look back. When I burst onto the brightly lit avenue, I spotted a group of late-night workers outside a diner. I rushed over, breathless, and they immediately noticed my distress. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, a young woman in a greasy apron. I nodded quickly, still shaking. Someone was following me. I think he meant to hurt me. They called the police, and I gave a description of the man. But when the officers arrived and canvassed the area, they found no sign of him. In the days after, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every stranger's glance felt like a threat. I changed my route home, avoided walking alone at night, and kept my phone in my hand, ready to call for help. But the worst part wasn't the fear itself. It was how ordinary it all felt. The man who followed me looked like any other person you'd see on the street. No masks, no weapons visible. Just a human being who decided to cross a line I never expected to exist in my quiet city life. I thought knowing the city would keep me safe. But now I know that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who wear no disguise at all. The days after that night felt like wading through a thick fog. The city that once felt like home had hardened into something unfamiliar, something sharp and unpredictable. I stopped taking the subway altogether, opting for buses or cabs even if it meant spending more money or waiting longer in the cold. I avoided the streets I'd always pass through without a second thought. Every sound, every shadow became a potential warning. But the thing that unsettled me most wasn't just the fear itself, it was the way the fear settled inside me, like a stone lodged somewhere deep in my chest. I wanted to tell someone, anyone. At first, I thought about calling my parents, who lived out of state, but I didn't want them to worry. My friends were scattered across the city, some still working late, others in apartments miles away. I texted my closest friend, Sarah, a few hours after the incident, typing and deleting the message multiple times before finally sending, "I think someone followed me last night." She replied within minutes, "Are you okay? Do you want me to come over?" But I brushed her off with a vague, "I'm fine. Just shaken up." The truth was, I wasn't fine. Not even close. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, the way he matched my pace, the way his eyes never left me, the softness in his voice that felt like a trap. There was no logic to it, no pattern I could grasp. If he wanted to hurt me, why hadn't he? And if he hadn't, why had he followed me so persistently? I tried to distract myself. Work became all-consuming again, and I stayed late not just out of necessity, but because the office felt safer than the streets. The fluorescent lights, the hum of computers, the steady rhythm of typing, it kept the darkness at bay. But by the end of the week, the tension was suffocating, and even the office walls seemed to close in. Then, 3 days after the subway incident, the first note appeared. It was slipped under my apartment door, no envelope, just a small folded piece of paper. I found it when I came home from work around 9 p.m., dropping my bag with a tired sigh. The hallway was empty except for the faint smell of damp carpet and a distant hum of a television from somewhere down the hall. I picked up the note, its paper rough and creased. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. It read, "You can't run." My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked up and down the hallway, but it was still empty. No footsteps, no shadows. I stuffed the note into my pocket and locked the door behind me, double-checking the chain latch. My hands trembled more than I wanted to admit. I didn't sleep that night, listening for any sound outside my window, the creak of a door, footsteps pacing the hallway, any indication that he was nearby. Over the next few days, the notes came more frequently. Sometimes taped to the outside of my mailbox, sometimes folded inside my shoe by the door, always the same jagged handwriting, always with short, chilling messages. I'm closer than you think. Don't trust the silence. We're watching. I reported it to the police, but without any physical evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. Detective Harris, the officer assigned to my case, was polite but distant. He told me to keep a log of any incidents and to call immediately if anything escalated. But his eyes betrayed a kind of tired skepticism, as if this was just another routine harassment complaint, nothing that would turn into something more. I understood. The city swallowed stories like mine every day. They rarely ended well. The isolation gnawed at me. I stopped answering the door unless I recognized the person. I avoided the mailroom and asked the building manager to hold my packages. I didn't want to have to explain the notes to anyone else, especially not the neighbors. Paranoia crept in, turning friendly greetings into suspect interactions. One afternoon, desperate for a break from the claustrophobia of my apartment, I went to the small cafe 2 blocks from my building. It was a modest place with chipped paint on the window frames and a faint smell of burnt coffee beans. I ordered a black coffee and sat near the window, hoping the presence of strangers would dull the edge of my fear. As I sipped, I noticed a man sitting alone at a table across from me, his eyes flickering between the newspaper he pretended to read and the door. He looked vaguely familiar, maybe someone who worked downtown or lived in the area. His fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop, a small twitch in his jaw. My skin prickled. I felt that same tightness from before. I debated whether to leave, but I forced myself to stay. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. As the afternoon drifted into early evening, I gathered my things and left the cafe, stepping out into a sky bruised with the first hints of dusk. The streets had more life now, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, the usual urban rhythm returning. Still, I kept my head down, eyes scanning every person I passed. That's when I saw him. Not the man from the subway, but someone else. He was standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost, smoking. Mid-30s, scruffy brown hair, worn leather jacket, the same unsettling presence. His eyes found mine immediately, that same cold sharpness. I froze for a moment, heart racing, before darting into an alley and slipping behind a dumpster. My breath came heavy as I peered around the corner. He stayed on the sidewalk, watching, expression unreadable. I couldn't tell how long I crouched there, but eventually, the street lights flickered on and the man melted into the crowd. I didn't know whether to call the police again or just keep running forever. Days later, I made an appointment with a therapist. I told her about the notes, the stalking, the fear that had taken root in every corner of my life. She listened quietly, nodding, and suggested a safety plan, changing my routines, installing better locks, even taking a self-defense class. It felt surreal, but also necessary. I wanted some control back. That night, as I lay in bed with the apartment dark except for the soft glow of my bedside lamp, my phone buzzed. A text message. No number. No name. Just one line. You can't hide. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold seep into my bones. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. I wasn't safe. Not anywhere. And he was still out there, watching. Waiting. The city was no longer a place I belonged. It was a maze, and I was its prey. The next morning, the sunlight felt sharp and unkind, forcing its way through the thin curtains like an intrusion. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the new message from last night still burned into my mind. You can't hide. The words echoed in my head, relentless and cold. I switched on my phone again, half hoping there'd be a reply, any clue, but there was nothing, no sender, no contact, no trace. I didn't want to leave my apartment. The thought of stepping outside made my chest tighten. But I knew I had to. Work wasn't going to wait, and neither was life, no matter how suffocating it felt. I made a point of leaving early to avoid the crowds. Changing my routine was part of the therapist's safety plan, after all. I told myself that was progress, that I was taking control. But the city was a spider's web, and every thread seemed to vibrate with some unseen movement beneath my feet. The streets were quieter in the morning. People shuffled by, heads down, earbuds in, coffee in hand. I kept my gaze low, but I couldn't stop scanning. Each reflection in a window, every passing shadow, set my nerves on edge. At the subway station, I felt the familiar pit of dread twist in my stomach as I descended the steps. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. I gripped my bag strap tighter, telling myself it was just the city noises, nothing more. And then I saw him. Not the man from before. This one was different, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, wearing a black hoodie pulled low over his face. He stood near the turnstiles but didn't move toward the platform. Instead, he just watched. Our eyes locked for a second, and I felt that same icy weight settle in my gut. His expression was unreadable, but his presence screamed warning. I didn't wait. I slipped past the turnstiles, keeping my head down, and boarded the next train heading uptown. The car was nearly empty, the hum of the subway a dull roar in my ears. I sat by the window, heart pounding, watching as the train carried me away. When I got home, I locked every door and window, double-checked the chain latch, and even wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. My phone buzzed again, another message, same untraceable sender. You can't escape. I stared at the screen, fingers trembling. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed everything, searching for patterns, for reasons, for any clue that might explain why someone was hunting me like this. The days blurred into one another. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. My therapist's office became my only refuge, a place where I could talk without feeling judged or scared. She urged me to file a restraining order, but without knowing who he was, what could it even do? One evening, I mustered the courage to walk to the local grocery store. It was a small place, the kind where the cashier knew you by name. I thought the familiarity would comfort me, but as I entered, something felt off. The bell above the door jingled, and I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw him again, the man with the hoodie. He lingered by the magazine rack, his face obscured but his gaze fixed on me. I forced myself to keep walking, picking up a few items without looking in his direction. My hand shook as I paid, and the cashier gave me a concerned glance. Outside, I broke into a run, not caring if I looked ridiculous. I didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, door locked behind me, sliding the chair back into place. I called Detective Harris again, leaving a message telling him about the grocery store encounter. There was no reply. The silence was maddening. Days later, I found another note slipped under my door. Stop running. It was different this time, bolder, angrier. The handwriting was messier, the edges torn. I cried that night, the fear spilling over in waves I couldn't control. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape, no end. The next morning, when I glanced out my window, I saw a figure standing across the street. Not moving, just watching. It was him. The man from the cafe, the one who had made me run into the alley. His eyes locked with mine, and I saw a dark satisfaction there. That was when I realized this wasn't random. It was personal. I thought about my therapist's advice to take a self-defense class. The idea of confronting this threat terrified me, but I knew I needed to be ready. I signed up for a beginner's course at a local gym. The first class was humbling. I was stiff, out of shape, and awkward. But the instructor was patient, teaching me how to stay aware, how to position myself, how to use my voice as a weapon. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in a long time: hope. One night, after class, I stopped at the corner cafe for a drink. The place was nearly empty. I sat near the window, watching the street. And there he was. The man with the hoodie. He didn't approach this time. Instead, he just stood across the street, smoking, eyes fixed on me. But I wasn't frozen anymore. I met his gaze and held it. My phone buzzed. A message: "See you soon." I swallowed hard, but I didn't look away. That night, I lay awake, heart hammering, hands clenched into fists. Fear was still there, thick and heavy. But so was something new. Determination. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to be his victim. Not without a fight. The morning light felt no less intrusive than it had the day before. I woke stiff and sore, muscles protesting from the self-defense class I hadn't wanted to attend but forced myself to go. I lay in bed longer than I should have, the message from last night gnawing at me: "See you soon." The words spun in my head, circular and relentless, a countdown to something I wasn't ready for. I forced myself up, pulling on jeans and a plain, dark sweater that might let me blend into a crowd, even if blending in had become a fragile illusion. The city outside my window was already awake, loud and indifferent. People rushed by, heads down, eyes glued to their phones, each one wrapped in their little bubble, none of them looking for me, none of them watching like he was. I debated calling Detective Harris again, but the silence from his end was a wall I couldn't break through. He wasn't coming to save me. I was on my own. I decided to change my route to work again, taking a longer walk through quieter streets I thought he wouldn't know. I kept my phone close, my grip tight around the strap of my bag. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see that black hoodie lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing, just the normal chaos of the city. Still, the normal chaos felt like a trap. On the subway platform, the usual cold buzz of fluorescent lights mixed with the distant roar of arriving trains. The crowd was sparse, mostly people like me, commuters caught in morning routines. I stood near the edge of the platform, purposely away from the turnstiles this time, eyes scanning the station. No one in a black hoodie. No one watching. The train arrived, sleek and noisy, catching the light in its metallic skin. I boarded and found a seat by the window. The car was nearly empty, the hum of the train a dull roar in my ears as it rumbled through the tunnels. I kept my head down but found my gaze drawn to the reflection in the glass, searching for any sign of him behind me. Nothing. By the time I got off at my stop, I felt a flicker of relief, fragile and fleeting. I walked swiftly to the office, nodding at the receptionist but not stopping to chat. My coworkers noticed the change, my tense shoulders, my darting eyes, but said nothing. There was no use explaining. People rarely understood. Everything felt like walking on eggshells. The day was slow, each minute dragging as I tried to focus on work but kept glancing at windows, doors, the street outside. I noticed a man sitting in the cafe across the street from the office building. At first, I thought it might be him, but his face was different, older, with a scar above his eyebrow I could barely make out. He stared at his phone, oblivious to me. Or maybe pretending to be. I shook the thought away. When the clock finally hit 5, I packed my bag with deliberate slowness. I didn't want to leave. But I had to. I had no choice. Outside, the city was already darkening, street lamps casting long shadows. I chose the well-lit route home, sticking to the main roads, avoiding shortcuts. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and froze. A new message. No number. Tonight. No other words. My hands trembled as I shoved the phone back into my pocket. My breath came fast and shallow. Tonight could mean anything. A meeting, a threat, a trap. I debated calling a friend to come over, but I knew it would only delay the inevitable. If he wanted to find me, he would. I walked faster, the tension thick in the air, every step echoing on the pavement. I kept my head down, but my eyes darted constantly. I reached my building and hurried inside. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He gave me a nod as I swiped my keycard. Upstairs, I double-checked the locks, sliding the chain across the door, wedging the chair beneath the knob again. It was a small fortress, but I wasn't naive enough to think it would hold forever. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at the screen. The minutes crept by, each one heavier than the last. Then came the knock. Soft at first. Tentative. My heart leapt into my throat. I didn't move. Knock. 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 Louder this time. I stayed frozen, breath caught in my chest, internally pleading for it to be a mistake. Someone else. But the knocks came again, deliberate, impatient. I reached for my phone, dialing 911, whispering my location. The line rang in my ear as I moved toward the door, hands shaking violently. "Who's there?" I called out, voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Another knock, harder. A voice, then. "Open up. I just want to talk." It was a man's voice, calm, low, with an edge of menace that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I backed away slowly, heart pounding like a drum. I had no idea what to do next. Suddenly, footsteps retreated down the hallway. The knock stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I locked the door again, sliding the chain into place, and sank against it, shaking. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. My phone buzzed once more. A message. Soon. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening for every sound, every whisper, every shadow that moved outside my door. And I realized something terrifyingly clear. He didn't need to break in to control me. Just the knowledge that he could was enough. And I was already his prisoner. The morning light spilled through the narrow gap in my blinds, too bright and too real to ignore. I lay still for a moment, my heart still hammering from the night's terror, the echo of those knocks and that voice lingering in my mind like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to face the world, but I knew I had to. Each day felt like a countdown, the seconds slipping away faster than I wanted to admit. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair, trying to steady my breathing. The phone was silent. No new messages. For the first time in a long while, that absence was almost worse than the threats themselves. It gave me too much time to think, and in my head, the worst-case scenarios piled up until I felt like I was drowning. I pulled on yesterday's sweater and jeans, the same dark, nondescript clothes I hoped would make me invisible, and checked the locks on the door again. The chain still held, the chair was wedged in place, but those were just physical barricades. The real prison was inside my head, a relentless anxiety that tightened its grip every time I heard a noise, every time my phone buzzed. I decided I couldn't stay inside all day. Even if it felt safer, I knew isolation wouldn't win this. So I forced myself out, stepping into the hallway and down to the lobby. The night security guard was gone now, replaced by a younger man with a clipboard and a distracted expression. He barely looked up when I swiped my key card. The elevator ride down was slow, the ding of each floor marking time like a heartbeat. Outside, the city was a different kind of threatening. It was alive and indifferent, full of people who noticed nothing and cared even less. I walked quickly but tried to keep my steps natural, avoiding the urge to scan every shadow or glance over my shoulder. I had to convince myself I was just another face in the crowd, not a target. I headed to the coffee shop around the corner, the one with the big windows and the faint smell of burnt espresso that somehow felt grounding. I ordered a black coffee and found a corner seat where I could see the street but not be easily seen. My phone buzzed, and I instinctively pulled it out. A message. No number again. Check the mailbox. My throat tightened. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it either. My mailbox was in the lobby of my building, down a flight of stairs and around the corner. The thought of going back so soon filled me with dread, but I had no choice. I finished my coffee in small sips, eyes flicking to the street every few seconds. When I left, I kept my head down, pulling my hoodie over my hair, blending in as best I could. The walk back was tense, every noise amplified, every passerby a potential threat. At the building, I took the stairs 2 at a time to the mailroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped inside, the smell of paper and dust thick in the air. I approached my mailbox and hesitated, fingers trembling as I slid the little door open. Inside was a small envelope, plain and white. No return address. I tore it open carefully, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a single piece of paper, neatly folded. I unfolded it slowly. It was a photo. A photo of me, standing right here, in this very mailroom, taken from behind. My reflection in the glass was clear, the fear in my eyes unmistakable. On the back, in sharp black ink, 2 words, watching you. I dropped the photo like it was burning my fingers. My heart slammed against my ribs, panic flooding through me. Someone had been inside my building, following me even now. I stuffed the photo back into the envelope and ran upstairs, locking the mailroom door behind me. The elevator ride back up was an eternity. When I reached my floor, I didn't stop by my apartment. Instead, I kept moving to the stairwell, climbing to the roof. The cold air hit me like a shock, the city's noise muffled beneath the hum of distant traffic. I stood there, gripping the rail, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't hide. Not really. He was everywhere. But I wasn't going to give up. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in days. "Detective Harris," I said when he answered, voice shaking but determined. "I need help. Someone's inside my building." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then he spoke, low and cautious. "I believe you. Tell me everything." I told him about the photo, the messages, the stalking, the knocks on my door. I told him about the fear, the loneliness, the way it was crushing me. And for the first time, I felt heard. He promised he'd send someone around that afternoon, plainclothes officers to watch the building, to try and catch whoever was doing this. I hung up, a flicker of hope sparking inside me. But it didn't last long. Because as I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me, my phone buzzed again. No number. No one's coming. And I realized something worse. This wasn't just about control. This was about power. And power was something he was willing to take, no matter the cost. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, the chilling truth settling in. This wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Story 4, Midnight Overtime, The Last Alarm. I never thought much about the house at the end of Maple Street, the one with the peeling white paint and the cracked porch steps. It was always there, standing silent and still, like it belonged to another time. Growing up, I passed it every day on the way to school, but I never stopped to look closely. It was just part of the neighborhood's backdrop, old and forgotten, like a raisin in a bowl of fresh fruit. It wasn't until last summer that I even considered stepping inside. I was 28 then, newly unemployed, and nursing a string of bad decisions that left me feeling brittle and hollow. The house came into my life in the most mundane way possible, through a Craigslist ad. The ad read, "Old house on Maple Street for rent. Cheap. Needs work. No pictures. No details. Just that." The rent was suspiciously low, even for the area, but I was desperate. I replied with a quick message and got a reply that same day. The landlord wanted to meet at the house. When I first saw it up close, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, tangled and wild, but the house itself, despite the obvious neglect, had a stubborn air about it, like it resisted decay. The windows were grimy, the shutters hung crooked, and the door creaked unsettlingly when I pushed it open. The landlord was a man in his late 40s, balding, with a thin mustache and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "You'll be responsible for the upkeep," he said, handing me a handwritten lease. The previous tenant left suddenly. Not much to say about him. Quiet guy. That was an understatement. The previous tenant was the first real clue that something about this house wasn't right. I signed the lease, took the keys, and moved in 2 days later. The first few nights were rough. The floors creaked under the weight of silence, and every bump and groan of the house sounded like a warning. But I was too exhausted to care. I slept with the windows open, the hum of the city drowning out my thoughts. It was on the third night that I started hearing the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. The house was old, after all. Floors expand and contract, pipes rattle. But these footsteps were different. They were deliberate, slow, paced with a rhythm that didn't match the creaks or the hums. They seemed to move from the basement to the second floor, and back. Upstairs, downstairs, back again. I told myself it was the landlord, or maybe a neighbor with a key, though no one had mentioned that possibility. I checked all the locks twice. Nothing was missing or disturbed. I even called the landlord, who claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. One night, I stayed awake until the footsteps stopped. I sat in the living room, staring at the narrow staircase that led to the basement. A sudden urge pulled me toward the darkness below. Swallowing my fear, I flicked on the flashlight and crept down the steps. The basement was damp and cold, smelling of mold and dust. The weak light quivered over crates and old furniture, but nothing moved. No sign of whoever or whatever had been making the noise. I told myself it was rats or mice. The landlord had mentioned an infestation to the previous tenant. But then I found the scratch marks. They were on the inside of the basement door, deep gouges that looked recent. Not made by animals, but by something or someone human. The jagged lines were spaced unevenly, like a frantic attempt to claw at the wood from the inside. That was when I realized the previous tenant hadn't just left suddenly. He had escaped. I called the local police, but they brushed it off. Old houses settle, the officer said. Sometimes people imagine noises if they're stressed. It was a polite way of saying I was paranoid. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written on plain notebook paper, folded unevenly. Don't trust the landlord. No signature. No explanation. I stuffed the note in my pocket and went for a walk. The town was quiet and sleepy, but I noticed the occasional glance from neighbors as if they knew something they weren't saying. I tried to ask around, but the answers were vague. "It's an old house," one woman said. "People come and go. Nothing special." But I knew better. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were accompanied by faint whispers, so low I could barely catch the words. I pressed my ear to the door to my bedroom and held my breath. "Help me," a voice breathed. "He's coming back." It stopped. The silence hammered in my ears. I wanted to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But I was trapped by my own stubbornness and the small pile of savings I had left. I decided to stay a few more days, to see if I could piece together the story. That night, I set up my phone to record audio. I wanted proof of what was happening. Hours passed with nothing but the hum of the fan and the distant sound of traffic. Then, around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, pacing the floor above me. I grabbed the flashlight and crept upstairs, heart pounding as I followed the sound toward the landlord's old office, now my bedroom. The door, which I always locked, was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair facing the wall. On the chair sat a folded newspaper, dated 5 years earlier. The headline caught my eye: "Local man vanishes from Maple Street." The article described the previous tenant's disappearance, mentioning suspicion but no leads. I shivered and closed the door. The footsteps stopped. In the following days, I learned more about the landlord. He had a history of renting to vulnerable people, students, drifters, the unemployed, and they always left in a hurry. Some disappeared altogether. When I confronted him, his eyes flickered, and he told me to mind my own business. I wasn't safe. I knew it. The house was a trap, and I was inside the maze. One afternoon, I found another note, this time taped to the basement door. "Don't open the door." I didn't know who had left it, but I believed them. That night, the footsteps became pounding. The whispers turned to desperate cries. I sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the nightmare unfold around me. When the knocking started, 3 sharp raps on the front door, my blood ran cold. I wasn't imagining anything. Someone was outside, waiting. And they knew I was alone. The knocking didn't stop. 3 quick raps, pause, 3 more, as if someone was testing me, measuring my reaction. I pressed my back against the cracked plaster wall next to the front door, the kitchen knife's hilt digging into my palm. My breath caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. I knew I should call the police, but my phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it in the chaos of the night. I waited, frozen. The street outside was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp across the road. Through the grimy window, I could just make out the silhouette of a man standing on the porch. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, still as a statue, watching. I swallowed hard. The footsteps upstairs had stopped abruptly the moment the knocking began. The house was silent except for that relentless tapping. I wished I could convince myself it was a prank, a neighbor messing around. But the weight of everything, the scratched basement door, the vanished tenants, the whispered warnings, pressed down on me. Finally, I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Just silence and the slow tick of the porch light's bulb. Summoning what little courage I had, I edged the door open, just enough to peer outside. The man was closer now, his face obscured by shadows, but I could see the outline of a worn jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. "Can I help you?" I asked, voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted slightly and pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. He extended it toward me, the gesture deliberate. I hesitated, then grabbed the note. He stepped back and vanished into the darkness before I could say another word. I shut the door and locked it quickly, heart thundering. The note felt heavy in my hand. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. "Get out. Now. He's watching." No signature, no address, no explanation. Just those 5 words. My phone buzzed suddenly on the kitchen counter. I hadn't heard it ring. I rushed over, an unknown number flashing on the screen. My fingers shook as I answered. "Hello?" I said. A distorted voice whispered back, barely audible. "Don't trust the landlord. He's dangerous." Then the line went dead. I sank onto the floor, pressed my forehead against the cold wood of the cabinet. Someone was trying to warn me. But who? And was it already too late? The house felt suddenly suffocating, the walls closing in as if they were alive. I remembered the basement door, the deep scratch marks. I'd been too afraid to open it again. But now, I had to know. I had to see if there was more to find. I grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed to the basement stairs. The air grew colder as I descended. The smell of mold thickened, wrapping around me like a wet blanket. My beam landed on the door. The note taped to it fluttered slightly in the draft. I hesitated, then peeled it off slowly, folding it and stuffing it into my pocket. The door was unlocked. My heart hammered as I pushed it open, revealing the basement's musty darkness. The flashlight scanned the room, old crates, spider webs, stacks of broken furniture. At the far end, I noticed something new, a series of footprints in a thick layer of dust. Bare footprints, pressed deep, leading to a small alcove behind a collapsed shelf. I crouched and moved aside the debris, revealing a narrow gap in the wall, a hidden crawl space, just big enough for a person. A shiver ran down my spine. The crawl space was dark and damp, the air stale. I shone the flashlight inside, and it reflected off something shiny, a small metal object. I reached in and pulled out a key, old and tarnished but unmistakably a key. My mind reeled. What door did it belong to? The landlord's office? The basement? The front door? Suddenly, a noise from upstairs snapped me out of my thoughts. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, but this time coming toward the basement. I scrambled back, heart pounding, and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped just outside. I held my breath as the basement door handle turned, rattling the lock. "Who's there?" I called out, voice steadier than I felt. No answer. The handle rattled again, then a soft chuckle, low and menacing. I backed away into the shadows, clutching the knife. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded. The house fell silent once more. I stayed downstairs, crouched behind a stack of crates, until the first pale light of dawn crept through the basement window. When I finally emerged, exhaustion weighed on me like a physical force. That morning, I resolved to find out exactly what the key opened and who was really behind all this. The landlord's glances, the vanished tenants, the secret crawl space, it all pointed to something darker than I imagined. I needed answers. But I also knew I wasn't dealing with an ordinary landlord. This was a man who had things and people in plain sight. And if I stayed, I might be next. I spent the next day scouring the house for any locked doors or hidden compartments. The landlord's office, my bedroom, had the old wooden door with the rusty lock. I tried the key. It fit perfectly. Inside, the room looked different somehow. The chair facing the wall had been moved to the corner, and the newspaper from 5 years ago was gone. Instead, there was a small, locked box on the desk. I tried to open it, but it was stuck tight. Frustrated, I pocketed the key and headed outside, hoping for some human contact that didn't feel like a trap. At the local diner, I asked around about the landlord. The waitress avoided my eyes but slipped me a crumpled piece of paper beneath the coffee cup. He owns more than he lets on. People disappear. Don't be next. The words sank like stones in my stomach. Back at the house, twilight was falling. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. I sat on the porch, the knife resting across my knees, and stared at the dark windows. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, a shadow flickering past the neighbor's window across the street. A man. Watching. Waiting. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and pulled the curtains tight. Whatever was coming, I knew I had to prepare. Because this house wasn't just a place to live. It was a cage. And someone else held the key. The weight of the key in my pocket felt heavier than ever as night settled again. I barely touched dinner, nerves gnawing at me like a vicious animal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting for something or someone to appear in the shadows. The porch light flickered erratically, the same one that had illuminated that silent figure the night before. It felt like a countdown clock ticking down an inevitable moment. I couldn't stay frozen any longer. I had to know what was inside that locked box. If the landlord was so dangerous, maybe that box held the key to everything, the truth behind the disappearances, the secret he'd buried beneath polite smiles and polite hellos. I steeled myself, flashlight and knife in hand, and headed back to the landlord's office. My fingers trembled as I lifted the box from the desk. The lock was rusted, but the key slid in smoothly. With a soft click, the lid gave way. Inside, I found a bundle of letters tied with twine, yellowed with age, and a small cassette tape sitting on top. The letters were mostly addressed to a name I didn't recognize, pages filled with desperate handwriting, pleading for help, begging for someone to listen. The tape was labeled simply, "Listen." I didn't have a cassette player now, but I found an old one in the basement during my earlier searches. It was dusty and looked as fragile as the box's contents, but I was desperate. I grabbed the tape and hurried down to the basement, the house eerily quiet except for the soft scrape of my feet on the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air thick with that damp, moldy smell. I found the cassette player on a shelf buried beneath old tools and boxes. After some fumbling, I got it plugged into a wall socket. It sparked a little, but it worked. I inserted the tape, pressed play, and sank against the concrete wall. The voice was distorted but unmistakably male. Hoarse, worn, and full of fear. If anyone finds this, please listen. My name is Mark. I was a tenant here, but I didn't leave. Not really. They keep us locked in. No one's safe. He watches everything. The landlord. I think he's hiding us somewhere. No one believed me, never made it out. But if you're listening, run. Don't trust him. The voice cracked, a sob leaking through. The tape hissed and crackled, then changed tone. I don't know who he is exactly, always so polite, but his eyes, they're dead. He punishes anyone who asks questions. The basement door, don't open it. Not alone. The others, they're behind the walls. The crawl space, it's not just storage. It's a prison. My heart hammered in my chest. I rewound the tape and listened again, desperate to catch every word. After the tape ended, I sat frozen, the small room spinning around me. Mark. A tenant. His voice filled with terror. A prison behind the walls. Not just a rumor or a nightmare. It was real. I needed to find those hidden rooms. The walls. The crawl space. I had to find whoever else might be trapped in this house. But how? The basement door was locked from the inside when I had checked before. The landlord's office was the only place with a locked container of secrets. I stood, shakily clutching the flashlight and knife, and crept back upstairs. The house was too quiet. Too empty. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I heard it then, a faint shuffle, like someone moving quietly upstairs. I froze, heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. Then a low creak like a floorboard groaning under weight. I moved toward the stairs slowly, trying to control my breathing, but it was no use. My hands shook too much to hold steady. There was definitely someone upstairs. Not the landlord, not a friendly neighbor. Someone else. I thought of the vanished tenants, the whispered warnings, the man who passed me the note. My mind raced. Was the landlord hiding more than just prisoners? Was someone else trapped, someone still alive, still here? I didn't want to find out by confronting them blindly. I crept back to the landlord's office, locking myself inside. My phone was still dead, useless, but the knife felt like the only protection I had. The flashlight flickered again, and I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. Then came the knocking. Soft, deliberate. Not at the front door this time, but at the back door, the one I'd noticed earlier, half concealed behind thick ivy and dust. I looked out the window. No one there. But the tapping moved to the porch again. And then a whispered voice, barely audible, scraping through the thin glass. Please, help me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to open the door, to shout back, but I was terrified. What if it was a trap? The landlord, or someone worse? But then the tapping changed, more urgent. And the voice came again, closer this time. Help me. I grabbed the key from my pocket and felt the cold metal bite into my skin. I had to do something. Slowly, I moved to the back door, each step heavier than the last. The knocking stopped. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, knowing this could be the moment everything changed, either my rescue or my downfall. My breath caught in my throat as I unlocked the door and cracked it open, peering out into the dark. There, barely visible in the gloom, was a woman. She was dirty, eyes wide and haunted, clothes torn and damp. She looked like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. Thank God, she whispered, voice shaking. I've been trapped. You have to help me. I pulled the door fully open, and she staggered inside, collapsing against me, trembling. Who is he? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. The landlord. He's not who he says. He's a monster. Please, don't trust him. I nodded, heart racing. Because now, I wasn't alone. And whatever came next, we'd face it together. But the question remained, how many more were still trapped in this house? And how long before he found out? The house wasn't just a cage. It was a prison. And the key was only the beginning. The woman's name was Emily. Her voice was a brittle thing, fragile and raw, like glass just on the verge of shattering. She sat on the floor just inside the door, one knee drawn up to her chest, clutching herself as though trying to hold together the pieces of what was left. I kept my flashlight trained on her face, the beam steady despite my shaking hands, trying to give her some comfort in this suffocating darkness. I don't know how long I've been here, she whispered, voice cracking. Weeks, maybe months. He doesn't keep us in one place. Moves us around in the house, mostly at night. Says it keeps us safe, but it's a lie. It's a prison. I swallowed hard, trying to absorb what she was saying. This wasn't some story, some twisted fantasy. It was real. And it was worse than I'd feared. Where are the others? I asked, my voice hoarse in the stillness. Emily shook her head. I don't know. Sometimes I hear voices quiet, muffled, like they're behind walls. Sometimes footsteps, or the scrape of furniture being dragged. I think they're locked somewhere in the crawl space or behind the walls, just like Mark said on the tape. Her eyes flickered toward the basement stairs. I've never been down there, but the door's always locked from the inside. We're trapped. The words hung heavy between us. The basement door locked from the inside meant someone was still there. Or had been, maybe still was. I pressed my lips tightly together, trying to think, trying to find any sliver of hope in this nightmare. Why did you come out now? I asked gently. Why risk being seen? Emily's hands trembled as she wiped at her face. He left the back door unlocked last night. I don't know why. I was scared and desperate. I couldn't take it anymore. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I thought if I could get out, get help, maybe someone else would come. But I'm so afraid now. What if he finds me? What if you're next? I clenched my jaw. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to help you. Help whoever else is trapped. She nodded, grateful but wary. I don't know how much time we have. The owls groaned around us, settling into the night, but there was something else, the faintest shuffle, a scrape coming from the hallway outside the door. I froze, gripping the knife tighter. Emily's eyes snapped wide. He's awake, she breathed. A slow, deliberate knock sounded on the landlord's office door. We didn't move. We just listened. Then, a voice, low, calm, chilling, drifted through the wood. You shouldn't have let her in. The landlord. His voice was colder than the November wind outside, stripped of any pretense of kindness. Emily whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. Who is he? I asked, trying to steady my voice. She swallowed hard. The landlord. But not just that. He controls the owls, controls us. He's dangerous. He's hurt people before. If he finds us here, if he knows we've escaped, it will be worse. The door handle rattled. I stepped in front of Emily, knife raised, breath shallow. Open up, the landlord ordered, voice deceptively calm. I shook my head. Please, Emily begged. Don't answer. The landlord's footsteps moved away. The silence stretched thin. We need to get out, I said urgently. Find a way to the others and leave. Emily nodded. There's a crawl space behind the pantry. I heard him moving something heavy in there when he thought I was asleep. That's where they keep the others. The pantry, I repeated, heart hammering. Lead the way. We moved carefully through the dark house, every creak and whisper setting my nerves alight. I kept the flashlight trained low, barely daring to breathe. The place felt alive, watching us. We reached the kitchen. Emily pointed toward a narrow door built into the floor beneath the pantry shelves. It's hidden, she said. But the latch is old. We might be able to open it. I knelt down, prying the hatch open with trembling fingers. A dark, musty hole yawned beneath us. The smell was thick, rotten, like mold and stale air sealed tight for years. Emily hesitated, then climbed down first, disappearing from view. I followed, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The crawl space was tight, cramped, walls close enough to touch on either side. The floor beneath was dirt, and I could hear faint, desperate whispers echoing faintly. Over here, Emily's voice came from up ahead. We crawled forward, the air growing colder and heavier. Then, suddenly, a soft sobbing. I shone the flashlight toward a faint outline, a figure huddled in the corner, frail and gaunt, clutching knees to chest. "Hey," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "You're safe now." The woman looked up, eyes wide and haunted, but full of relief. "Thank God," she whispered. Emily and I exchanged a glance. There were more voices, more trapped behind these walls. We found two others, weak, scared, but alive. They had been hidden away, prisoners in the landlord's twisted game. But our respite was short-lived. From above, a sudden thud echoed the landlord. He had discovered the missing hatch. The crawlspace door shook as he tried to force it shut. "We have to move," I hissed. "Now!" We scrambled back into the cramped passage, the walls seeming to close in around us. Panic surged as the landlord's muffled shouts grew louder. I led them through the crawlspace, following Emily's whispered directions to a narrow exit beneath the house. The air tasted of dirt and desperation. We emerged into the cold night, hearts racing, breaths forming clouds in the frosty air. "We need to leave," I said firmly. "Find help. Call the cops." But Emily shook her head, fear in her eyes. "He watches everything," she whispered. "He'll know if we try to leave. We need a plan." I nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down. We couldn't just run blindly. We had to outsmart him. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something fierce take root inside me, a desperate, burning need to fight back. We weren't just victims. We were survivors. And we were coming for the truth. As we slipped into the shadows of the night, I knew one thing with brutal certainty. This house wasn't just a prison. It was a trap. And the landlord was the predator waiting inside. The night outside was a bitter slap against my skin, cold wind slicing through the threadbare jacket I'd grabbed in haste. We slipped silently through the back alley behind the house, the moonless sky swallowing us whole, hiding our ragged breaths and nervous footsteps. My flashlight was off now, my hands trembling too much to hold it steady. The others, the gaunt woman and two smaller figures, followed closely, their eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and terror. Emily moved in front, leading the way with a cautious urgency that suggested she knew every shadow and crack in these narrow passageways. I kept my knife sheathed but close, aware that any noise or misstep could alert the landlord or, worse, someone else who might be lurking. There was no telling what kind of people he surrounded himself with, people cruel enough to aid him or indifferent enough to let it happen. The whole thing felt like a nightmare choking on its own darkness. I glanced back one last time at the house, its windows dark but somehow still watching. The landlord's voice echoed in my mind, cold and accusing, "You shouldn't have let her in." He'd meant Emily, but I knew that threat was meant for all of us. Whoever he was a man who thrived on control, on fear. And now that we'd broken one link in his chain, I feared what he might do next. "Where'd we go?" I whispered to Emily once we hit a quieter street, away from the house's immediate shadow. She shook her head, her eyes darting back the way we'd come. "There's a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks down. I thought maybe we could call someone from there. But it's risky." Her voice cracked. "If he's watching. If he's tracking us." I nodded. "We don't have a choice." The others were silent, too scared or too weak to speak. I felt a surge of responsibility like nothing I'd ever known. We were all vulnerable, but that didn't mean we couldn't be dangerous if we stuck together. We kept moving, sticking close to the buildings, avoiding streetlights and any glimmer of a passerby. The city at night was a different beast, empty, but never quite safe. I knew the statistics. Crimes increased after dark, and we were exactly the kind of prey that predators sought out. The convenience store came into view, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly. I stopped us just out of sight, peering through the grimy window. Inside, a lone clerk stood behind the counter, half asleep, scrolling through his phone. No customers. It was our chance. "Stay here," I whispered. "I'll go in and call the police." Emily shook her head fiercely. "No. I'll come. I know what to say. I'll tell them someone's trapped in that house, that he's dangerous." I hesitated. She looked fragile, but her voice held a quiet steel that surprised me. Maybe this was her moment to be brave, to reclaim some of herself from the nightmare. We slipped inside carefully. The clerk looked up as we approached, eyes blurry, but alert. Emily's hand shook as she fumbled for her phone. "There's someone trapped," she said quickly, voice low but urgent. "In a house nearby. The landlord is dangerous. We need help." The clerk blinked, then reached for the phone. "You want me to call the cops?" "Yes." "Please," Emily said, swallowing hard. I watched the clerk dial, glancing nervously at the door as if expecting the landlord to burst in at any moment. A minute passed in agonizing silence. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. Emily spoke quickly but clearly, giving the address, the situation, explaining about the people locked inside, the basement, the crawl space, the landlord's name. I felt chills as I listened to her recount the story that had felt so unreal just hours before. The clerk hung up and turned to us. "They're sending officers now. Should be here in 5 minutes." 5 minutes felt like an eternity. I kept pacing near the door, ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The others sat on the floor, trained, eyes glazed with relief but haunted by what lay ahead. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, flashing blue and red lights painted the walls outside. The distant wail of sirens grew closer. Emily's grip tightened on my arm. "They're here." We rushed outside to meet the police, but as we stepped into the cold light of the street, a shadow detached itself from a nearby alley and blocked our way. It was him. The landlord. His face was pale in the streetlights, ice cold and hard as flint. The calm menace in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. "So you thought you could run?" My heart slammed against my ribs, adrenaline flooding through me. The knife was gone from my hand. We hadn't thought to bring weapons to a public street, but now I wished I'd held onto it. The officers stopped short, their hands hovering near their holsters. The landlord raised his hands slowly, as if to show he meant no harm, but his smile was cruel. "I'm just here to talk." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "You can't keep us here. You can't hurt us anymore." His smile faded. "You don't understand. I protect this place. I keep order. People like you, you don't belong here." One of the officers spoke firmly. "Sir, step back. We're responding to reports of illegal detention. We need you to cooperate." The landlord's gaze flicked from Emily to me, then to the others huddled behind us. His jaw tightened, rage barely contained. Then, without warning, he bolted past the officers and disappeared into the shadows. "Hey!" one of the police shouted, giving chase. But he was already gone. We were left standing there, the cold seeping into our bones, the night swallowing the landlord and his secrets once more. The officers turned to us, their faces serious. "We're going to search the house," one said. "You're safe now. We'll get everyone out." I looked at Emily, at the others, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself believe it could end. But deep down, I knew the landlord's grip wasn't so easily broken. He wasn't just a man, he was a force born from fear and control, and forces like that don't vanish quietly. As the police began their work, I felt the weight of what we'd uncovered settle heavily. This was just the beginning. Story 5, Beneath the Badge's Smile. I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon in early October, the kind of day when the sun was warm, but the air carried a slight chill hinting at winter's approach. I was sitting in my usual spot at the corner table of the cafe, a little place tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat on Elm Street. I had just unwrapped a sandwich and was about to take the first bite when I noticed him. He was standing outside the cafe, across the street, just beyond the pedestrian crossing. At first, he looked like any other passerby, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, hands shoved deep into his pockets, head tilted down so his face was obscured. But then I realized he wasn't moving. Not really. Just swaying gently, like a tree caught in a light breeze. And his eyes were fixed on the cafe window, on me. I froze mid-bite. My heart was pounding in my chest, louder than the hum of conversation around me. The cafe was busy, but no one else seemed to notice the man staring across the street. I tried to catch his face in the reflection of the glass, but the foggy window distorted it, only a vague outline, a shadow. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was waiting for someone, maybe just resting for a moment. Elm Street was a busy route, after all, and dark hoodies were common in October. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, the prickling on my skin, the sudden awareness of every sound, every movement around me. I gulped down the rest of my coffee and grabbed my bag, deciding to leave before the feeling got worse. Outside, the man was gone. I looked up and down the street. No sign of him. The street was just as I'd always known it, cars parked along the curb, people walking dogs, a woman pushing a stroller. Normal. But the unease clung to me as I started walking toward my apartment, just a few blocks away. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked, half expecting to see the man appear behind me. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. My apartment building was older, built in the 1950s, with peeling paint and creaky wooden floors in the hallways. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine, my safe place. When I got inside and locked the door, I felt a small wave of relief. I turned on the lights, checked my phone, and tried to shake off the lingering dread. I called my best friend, Mark, hoping to hear a familiar voice to calm me down. Mark was easygoing and never got rattled, the kind of friend who could make a joke out of anything. When he answered, I told him about the man outside the cafe. He laughed. Probably just a weirdo or a homeless guy. Elm Street is full of them. He tried to brush it off, but I could hear the concern in his voice, masked behind his usual sarcasm. Maybe. Still, it felt off. I hesitated before saying it out loud. Like I was being watched. Mark was silent for a moment. Look, if he comes around again, call me. I'll come over. I appreciated that, but I didn't want to worry him more than necessary. The next day was Friday, and I made sure to avoid the cafe. Instead, I grabbed a coffee from the gas station on the corner, trying to keep my routine but not make it obvious I was on edge. The streets felt different now, more hostile somehow. I noticed people glancing in my direction, or so I thought. Maybe it was paranoia. When I got to work at the law office downtown, I told my coworker, Jenna, about the guy. Jenna was practical, no nonsense, and had a habit of cutting through nonsense quickly. Did he say anything to you? She asked. No, I said. Just stared. She raised an eyebrow. Could be nothing. Or someone casing you. Casing me? Like for a robbery? Maybe. Or worse. She looked around the office, then lowered her voice. "You never know these days." Her words stuck with me as the day wore on. I tried to focus on my cases, but every time I heard footsteps behind me, I jumped. That evening, I took the long way home, through a well-lit park, hoping to avoid dark alleys or empty streets. My phone's flashlight was on, and I kept it ready in my hand. I passed a group of teenagers laughing loudly, a couple walking their dog, and a man sitting alone on a bench. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, as I neared my building, I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate. I stopped and looked back. No one there. I began to walk faster, heart pounding again. The footsteps matched my pace, then slowed when I slowed. I reached the entrance to my building and fumbled with my keys, trying not to drop them. The footsteps stopped. I looked up. No one. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, shaking. For the next few days, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I grew paranoid about every shadow, every unusual sound. I changed my routine, no more cafes or parks, no more walking home alone after dark. I even started carrying pepper spray, something I never thought I'd do. One night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by my phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number. "I see you." I stared at the screen, frozen. I wasn't sure if I wanted to call the police or pretend it never happened. But the message was clear. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. The realistic horror of it all was that the threat wasn't supernatural. It was human. And I had no idea who or why. End of chapter 1. I didn't sleep much that night. The message from the unknown number, "I see you," kept flashing on my phone screen like a warning sign. I stared at it for what felt like hours, willing myself to move, to do anything other than sit frozen in bed, my heart hammering so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it. Eventually, I forced myself to lock the phone and push it under my pillow, but the unease didn't fade. It only grew heavier. The next morning I woke up with a headache, the kind that stubbornly lingers after a bad night. The sun was already high, but the world outside my window looked bleaker, as if someone had drained the color from the day. I thought about calling Mark, but hesitated. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. Still, I knew I couldn't go on like this alone. I texted him. "Got a creepy message last night. We need to talk." His reply came quickly, short and to the point. "I'm on my way." That was a relief, at least. Mark had always been the pragmatic one, the kind of friend who'd rather tackle a problem head-on than spiral into fear. When he arrived, I let him in immediately, even though I was still half expecting to see the dark hoodie lurking outside. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. Mark sat down on the faded couch, watching me with those steady, calm eyes of his. "So, what's the deal?" he asked. I showed him the message and the unknown number. "I don't know who it is. It's probably some sick joke, but I'm scared, Mark. I feel like this isn't random." He frowned, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't reply?" "No. I don't want to encourage whoever it is." He nodded. "Good. Don't. But we have to figure out who this is. You've got to tell me everything, anything weird that happened before this started." I went over everything, the man outside the cafe, the footsteps behind me in the park, the glances I thought I caught on the street. I even mentioned the pepper spray. Mark didn't laugh or dismiss any of it. "Sounds like someone's stalking you, or at least trying to intimidate you." The word stalking made my stomach twist. It sounded so clinical and cold, but it fit too well. "Have you told Jenna or anyone at work?" he asked. I mentioned it. She was worried but didn't want to make a big deal out of it. yet. Mark was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "We can't just sit on this. We should check the number, see if it's traceable." "Have you tried that?" I did a reverse lookup. Nothing came up. Could be a burner phone, or someone using a messaging app with a masked number. That narrows it down, doesn't it? Mark said, his voice low. We spent the morning scouring the internet for any advice on dealing with stalking or harassment. Everything we read emphasized documentation, police reports, evidence gathering. I hated the idea of involving the cops. I didn't want to be that person, the paranoid, panicked defendant. But Mark was firm. "You have to report it. At least it's on record if something worse happens." I agreed. That afternoon, we went to the local police station. The officer at the front desk was polite but professional, clearly used to these kinds of reports. I explained everything to the man at the cafe, the footsteps, the text message. The officer took notes and asked detailed questions. "Have you noticed any suspicious vehicles? Anyone following you to work or home?" "No," I said honestly. "Just the one guy at the cafe at first." He leaned back, folding his arms. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, keep your phone charged, stay in well-lit areas, and don't hesitate to call 911 if you feel threatened." I nodded, feeling a fragile comfort in the official response. But it was still just words. I didn't feel safer. Back home, I tried to settle into some normality, but every noise made me jump. The doorbell ringing had me nearly dropping the phone. I peeked through the peephole, no one there. The next few days felt like walking through molasses. I barely left the apartment except for work, and even then, I took different routes, always alert. One evening, on my way back, I caught a glimpse of a figure across the street, a man in a dark hoodie, standing still beneath a street lamp. My breath caught. I ducked behind a parked car and waited, heart pounding, until he moved on. I wanted to scream, to run, but I forced myself to keep walking, keys clenched in my fist. That night, Mark stayed over. We installed extra locks on my door and set up a cheap security camera aimed at the entrance. I hated feeling like a prisoner in my own home. The messages continued. Sporadic texts from different unknown numbers, each one chilling. "Watching you. Don't look back. You can't hide." Each message was like a slap, a reminder that someone was out there, patient and cruel. One morning, I found a small package slipped under my door. Inside was a single photo, a snapshot of me, taken from across the street, outside the grocery store the day before. I stared at it, feeling violated and terrified. I wanted to throw it away, but Mark insisted we keep it as evidence. I realized then this wasn't random. Someone was tracking me, studying me, and waiting for the right moment. I felt trapped in a nightmare where the monster wasn't supernatural, but human, calculating and relentless. And I didn't know how to escape. The days that followed blurred into a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. I barely left the apartment except for work, and every step outside felt like a gamble. The photo in the little package haunted me, that quiet proof that someone had been watching me closely enough to snap a picture from across the street. I kept it tucked away in my desk drawer, alongside the printout of the text messages. Mark said evidence was everything, but I hated what it represented, a tangible reminder that my privacy was gone, and maybe my safety too. I tried to sleep. I really did. But every noise, the creak of the building settling, the hum of a car idling too long outside, footsteps on the stairs, made my heart jump. I wasn't sure if I was on the edge of a panic attack or just plain exhaustion. Mark was a constant presence, which helped, but even he admitted this wasn't something you could fix overnight. "This isn't a horror movie," he said grimly one night. There's no hero who's going to swoop in and save the day. We have to be smart, patient. Smart was a word I clung to. I started carrying my pepper spray everywhere, even inside the apartment while I walked from room to room. I double-checked the locks obsessively and kept the little security camera running 24/7. I even changed my work schedule, arriving earlier and leaving before nightfall. But none of it made the sense of being watched go away. I thought about the police report often. The officers I'd spoken to had been polite but distant, the kind of professional distance that means this happens all the time, and most of it gets nowhere. Keep your phone on you and call us if you see anything suspicious, one officer had said. It was the right thing to do, but I didn't know if it was enough. It was a Wednesday when things escalated. I was walking home, taking a new route Mark suggested, one that was more populated and had better lighting. It was just after dusk, the kind of dim afternoon light that lingers before the sun fully sets. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out quickly, heart in my throat. Another message. Look up. I froze. Around me, people passed on the sidewalks, trucks rumbled past, and a few cars slowed at the intersection nearby. I glanced upward, scanning the windows of the buildings along the street. Nothing. No movement. No figure lurking in the shadows. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and quickened my pace. But then, a noise, a soft shuffle from behind me. Feet hitting the pavement, matching my speed. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. I didn't want to know if the person was close enough to grab me or far enough to give me a moment to call for help. I heard the footsteps slow down, then speed up. I forced myself to keep walking, my breath short and shallow. At the corner, I broke into a run, weaving through a small crowd gathered outside a coffee shop. I ducked inside without thinking, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. The warmth of the shop was sharp against the cold evening air. The barista looked up at me, eyebrows raised. "Just a coffee, please," I said quickly. I pulled out my pepper spray before I ordered, just in case, gripping it tightly. The shop was busy, the hum of conversation a strange comfort in the chaos of my mind. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone following. The street was empty, save for a few people walking their dogs or heading home. Mark called me about 20 minutes later, checking in. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Someone followed me for a bit, but I got inside the cafe. "I'm safe now." "Good," he said, relief clear in his voice. "Did you call the police?" "No. Not yet. I'm afraid to look like I'm overreacting." "Don't worry about that. If someone's following you, it's real. We'll handle it." He promised to stay with me that night. It helped, having him there, a steady presence in the dark. I kept the security camera on, and every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. The next day, I found a note slipped under the door, neat handwriting, almost deliberate. "You can't hide forever." I didn't tell Mark right away. I shoved the note into the same drawer as the photo and the texts, feeling a cold wave of helplessness. I thought about who this person could be. Was it someone I knew? Someone from work? A neighbor? The man outside the cafe? The hoodie figure from the street lamp? The not knowing was the worst part. Mark suggested installing more cameras, maybe outside the building, if the landlord agreed. I nodded, feeling drained but knowing it was necessary. We called the landlord that afternoon. He was a gruff man, more interested in rent than security, but he agreed to let us put up a camera in the hallway outside my door, on the condition that Mark or I paid for it. I didn't care. I wanted every possible safeguard. The weekend arrived, and with it, a fragile sense of routine returned. Mark stayed over again, and I tried to focus on work. But the messages kept coming. One afternoon, minutes after I'd left the building for a quick lunch, I got a photo. It was a picture of my unlocked bike, chained outside the apartment complex. I didn't own a bike. I stared at the screen, hands shaking. Someone had been inside the building while I was gone. Someone had left a message that wasn't just words anymore, it was an intrusion. A violation. I called Mark immediately. "I'm coming over," he said without hesitation. When he arrived, we checked the security cameras. The footage showed a shadowy figure lingering in the hallway outside my door for several minutes. The video was grainy, but the person wore a dark hoodie, the same as before. Mark paused the video, zoomed in on the face just as the person glanced toward the camera. "It's hard to tell," he said, "but does that look like a tattoo on the neck?" I frowned. I'd never paid attention before. "Maybe," I said. "I don't know." We sat in silence for a moment. "I'm going to talk to some friends," Mark finally said. "See if anyone's heard about this kind of thing. Or if they know anyone who fits the description." I nodded, feeling grateful but still terrified. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake, listening for the smallest sound. The doorbell rang twice around 3 a.m., but when I peeked through the peephole, no one was there. My phone buzzed with a new message. "Next time, I won't just leave a photo." I didn't reply. But I knew this was no longer just harassment. This was a threat. And I was running out of options. The next morning, I woke with a tight knot in my stomach, the kind that made every breath feel shallow and every noise deafening. The sun was shining through the thin curtains, but it didn't help. I hadn't slept more than 2 restless hours, and the memory of the 3 a.m. doorbell ringing and the message that followed clung to me like a dark cloud. Mark was already up when I stumbled into the kitchen, his face drawn but determined. He'd spent the night scouring online forums and reaching out to contacts. "I found something," he said quietly, pouring 2 coffees. "Not exactly what we hoped for, but it's something." I perched on the edge of the table, clutching my mug as if it were a lifeline. "What is it?" "There's a pattern," Mark explained. "People who get stalked like this, harassed with messages, sometimes photos, and then threats, they usually know the person. Or at least cross paths with them. It's rarely random. The police refuse to see it that way, but it's true." I nodded, swallowing hard, my eyes tracing the steam rising from the cup. "So someone I know is doing this?" "Maybe. Or someone who's been watching you for a while." He hesitated, then added, "You said you didn't tell your landlord everything?" I shook my head. "He doesn't want to get involved. Said it's not his problem unless it damages the building." Mark frowned. "We need more eyes on this place, inside and out. If the landlord isn't cooperating, we'll have to get creative." Before I could ask what he meant, my phone buzzed again. The screen showed a new text, but before I could open it, Mark snatched the phone. "Let me see that." He read the message silently, then looked up. "It's just another photo. This time, it's the inside of your apartment. The living room, to be exact." I froze. "How?" "That's the thing. The door was locked. And the security footage from last night shows no one coming in or out." I stared at the screen, heart hammering. So someone has a way in without me knowing. Mark shook his head, voice low. "It could be a spare key. Or maybe something more sophisticated, lock-picking, or even someone inside the building." The thought made my skin crawl. We spent the day reviewing every piece of footage again. The cameras captured the hallways, the lobby, even the stairwells, but there was no sign of forced entry or suspicious activity during the times the photos were taken. It was like the intruder moved in and out without a trace. Mark suggested we talk to the neighbors. Maybe they've seen something. Or heard noises. Sometimes people notice more than they realize. I hesitated but agreed. We started with the apartment next to mine, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Carter, who was mostly quiet but friendly enough when we bumped into each other in the hallway. When we knocked, she opened the door cautiously. "Hi, Mrs. Carter." "Sorry to bother you," Mark said gently. "We live next door and wanted to check if you've noticed anything unusual lately. Any strangers, noises, anything at all?" She glanced past them into her apartment before nodding slowly. "Well, now that you mention it, I thought I heard footsteps in the hall late at night, a few times this week. Usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. But I just figured it was someone coming home late." "Did you see who it was?" I asked. "No, I didn't look," she admitted. "I wasn't sure if I should. I live alone, and honestly, I'm a little scared to get involved." I felt a pang of sympathy. We were all on edge now, trapped in this invisible threat that crept around us in the dark. "Thank you for telling us," Mark said. "If you hear anything again, please let us know. And call the police right away if you feel unsafe." She nodded, closing the door slowly. We moved on to the other neighbors on the floor, but most were either out during the day or unwilling to talk. By evening, the atmosphere in the apartment had turned oppressive. The weight of the unknown pressed down on me, making the walls feel like they were closing in. Mark was pacing near the window, phone in hand. "I got a friend who works at the precinct. I'm going to see if he can push for more patrols around here. Maybe get someone to check the building more often." I reached for my pepper spray, the familiar grip grounding me in the chaos. "Do you think this will stop them?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But we have to keep fighting. You're not alone in this." That night, I set up an extra lamp in the living room, leaving it on throughout the night. I moved the camera to cover the hallway from a different angle, hoping to catch anything we'd missed. At 1:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, hands trembling. Another message. "Stop looking." I didn't reply. I felt the room closing in, the shadows growing thicker. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the apartment door. Slow. Deliberate. I gripped the pepper spray tightly, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. The footsteps stopped. A pause. A scraping noise, like someone pressing a key against the lock. I held my breath. Then, a soft metallic click. The door handle turned slowly. I sprayed the pepper spray blindly as the door swung open. The rush of air hit me first, then the faint silhouette of a figure recoiling. Mark was there in an instant, shoulder barging the door fully open, blocking the way. "Get back," he barked. The figure stumbled backward into the hallway, a tall man wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured by shadow. "Police!" Mark shouted into his phone, already dialing. The man turned and fled down the stairs before we could see more. My knees nearly gave out, but Mark held me steady. The sirens came soon after. When the officers arrived, they swept the building but found no sign of the man. "Did you get a look at him?" one officer asked. "Not really," Mark said. "But he was the same one from the security footage, the guy with the tattoo on his neck." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll file this as an attempted break-in and stalking. We'll send patrols more often." I wanted to believe them. That night, Mark stayed again, his presence a lifeline. But the fear was no longer just in my mind, it was real, tangible, and inside my own home. I realized then that safety wasn't about locks or cameras. It was about fighting back. And I wasn't going to give up. The morning after the attempted break-in felt like walking out into a burned-out city. I woke up with tightness in my chest, every muscle sore, every nerve raw from the night's adrenaline. Mark had stayed over, as promised, turning the living room into a makeshift command post with laptops, notebooks, and a scatter of printouts. But as daylight crept through the blinds, the dread that had been coiled in my gut the night before didn't loosen. Instead, it grew heavier. We decided that I wouldn't be alone anymore. Mark was going to take shifts, and I'd install additional security measures. But I could see that no matter what we did, the real problem was the person who thought they could invade my space without consequences. That morning, Mark was pacing again, phone pressed to his ear, his brows furrowed in concentration. I sat at the kitchen table, clutching a half-cold coffee, trying to steady my shaking hands. The apartment felt different now. Every creak of the pipes, every distant siren sounded like a warning. Mark hung up. "No luck with the precinct," he said. "They're swamped with other cases, and it sounds like ours isn't a priority unless something really bad happens." I let out a bitter laugh. "So I have to wait until I get hurt before they care?" "More or less," he admitted. "But I'm not giving up. I've got a few more people I can call. Private security, maybe." The idea of hiring someone to stand watch felt like admitting defeat, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. I was living with a stranger who had the keys to my front door and the patience to wait in the shadows. We spent the afternoon going through the messages again, looking for clues. There was nothing new, just the same cryptic threats and photos. The photos had stopped for now, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they started up again. Whoever this was wasn't going to back down. Later, I went to the building manager's office again. The landlord was there this time, sitting behind a cluttered desk, his expression unreadable. "I need to talk to you about the security in the building," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced up, ice cold. "I'm aware of the situation. But as I told you, unless someone damages the property, there's not much I can do." "Someone has a key," I said, voice rising despite myself. "Someone was inside my apartment last night." He shrugged. "Maybe. But unless you get a police report with solid evidence, I can't change the locks or install new cameras." "I'm asking you to care," I said, frustration boiling over. "Because right now, this isn't just about property damage. It's about my safety." He ignored the plea and looked at his watch. "I have a meeting. Let me know if anything else happens." I walked out, stomach sinking. If even the people responsible for the building didn't care, who could I turn to? That night, Mark stayed again, and together we set up a makeshift watch schedule. I kept the pepper spray close, the front door chained, and the living room lamp burning late into the night. Every noise made me jump. I didn't sleep much. At around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed again. I didn't even need to check the screen to know it was from him. "Why won't you just stop?" I swallowed hard, the words stabbing at me like ice. Then, a second message came. "I see you." The apartment suddenly felt suffocating. I wanted to scream, throw the phone against the wall, do anything to break free from the invisible leash tied around my neck. Mark was awake, watching me closely. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. Not really. The next day, Mark and I went back to the hallway cameras, watching the loops again. We noticed something new. Someone had been lurking in the shadows of the stairwell, just out of frame, several times over the past week. "Look at this," Mark said, pausing the footage. "He's waiting for someone." I stared at the dark figure, hood pulled low, shifting nervously. The same guy from the night before. How does he keep getting so close without anyone noticing? I whispered. Mark shook his head. Because no one wants to get involved. People see shadows but pretend not to notice. We decided to speak with Mrs. Carter again. This time, she was hesitant but admitted hearing footsteps almost every night. It was clear she was scared, maybe more than I realized. I don't want to be a part of it, she said quietly, but maybe I could keep an eye out. Her words were a small victory. That evening, Mark and I installed an old door jammer we found online, something extra to lock the door from the inside. It wasn't foolproof, but it was one more barrier. As I lay in bed, Mark beside me, I felt the familiar tightness again. But there was something else this time, a spark of defiance. I wasn't going to let this person take over my life. The following days were a blur of exhaustion and vigilance. I barely left the apartment, and when I did, Mark went with me. Even the simplest errands became missions. Then, one afternoon, Mark's phone rang. It was his friend from the precinct. They caught someone, Mark said, voice low but urgent. Someone with a record for stalking and breaking into apartments. My heart pounded. Are you sure it's the same guy? They found him near your building last night. The tattoos matched the description from the security footage. Relief was overwhelming but tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. The man was in custody, but the fear wouldn't just vanish overnight. That night, for the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without Mark's presence or the constant hum of the security cameras. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The nightmare wasn't about to end, it was just changing shape. Because the real horror wasn't the man in the hoodie or the threats. It was the invisible line between safety and danger, and how easily it could be crossed by someone you never expected. Story 6: Silent Orders of the Trusted Few. I never thought something like this could happen in my own neighborhood. Looking back now, I realize how blind I was, how ordinary the days seemed before everything unraveled. But at the time, it all just felt like the usual grind: work, sleep, repeat, small talk with neighbors I barely knew, the comforting hum of suburban normalcy. That illusion shattered the moment I found the front door of my apartment wide open one cold November evening. It began on a Monday. I had just gotten home from work around 7 p.m., juggling my grocery bags and fumbling for my keys in the dark. The street was quieter than usual, no distant laughter from kids playing, no sound of cars passing by. Just an eerie stillness that I didn't immediately register as strange. I should have. The air smelled different too, sharp and metallic, but I didn't think much of it. I was tired and just wanted to get inside and make dinner. When I pushed the door, it swung open with a soft creak, and I froze. I'm careful about locking up. Always have been. But the deadbolt was undone. My heart jumped into my throat as I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" Just in case someone was hiding, maybe a neighbor who had a spare key or a friend who decided to drop by unexpectedly. No answer. The living room was dim, the only light came from the flickering street lamp outside. Everything looked untouched, but an unsettling feeling crept over me like a cold hand on my back. I set the bags down slowly, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock the door that morning? Did someone break in while I was at work? I almost didn't want to look any further, but I needed to check if anything was missing. The apartment was cluttered, it was a mess, but nothing seemed out of place. The TV was on mute, the couch cushions had their usual dents, and my laptop was still where I left it on the dining table. Then I heard it, a faint noise coming from the bedroom. A soft shuffling, like someone moving around carefully so as not to be heard. I froze again, every instinct on high alert. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy hardcover book, and crept toward the door. My breath quickened, but I told myself to stay calm. It could be a mistake, maybe a neighbor who had gotten locked out, or a delivery person who had left the door open by accident. I pushed the door open slowly, and the room was empty. Nothing was out of place, except for a small photo frame lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a family picture from a few years ago, framed in silver with a thin black border. Never had I seen it lying like that. Someone had been in my bedroom. I backed out of the room, heart pounding wildly. That's when the noise came again, this time from the kitchen. I gripped the book tighter, moving quickly but quietly. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow from the streetlight filtering through the window. I switched on the light, and my eyes darted around. The fridge door was slightly ajar, and on the counter, the knife block was disturbed. The chef's knife was missing. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Someone had been here and had taken a knife. For what? I didn't want to think about it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address as calmly as I could. The operator told me to stay put and wait for the police. I locked myself in the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the book like a lifeline, every creak and whimper of the apartment making my skin crawl. It was almost 20 minutes before a pair of police officers arrived, flashlights cutting through the dimness as they swept the unit. They found no one, no forced entry, no fingerprints other than mine. The missing knife was explained as possibly having been misplaced earlier and forgotten. They assured me everything would be fine and advised me to be cautious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, watching me, following me, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. My phone buzzed once, displaying a message from an unknown number. We're closer than you think. Panic overwhelmed me, but so did a grim determination. Whoever was doing this wanted to scare me, and they'd succeeded. But I refused to be a victim. I started locking every door twice, installing extra locks, and looking out the window every few minutes, searching the dark for shapes that weren't there or maybe were. By Wednesday, the messages escalated. Another text, "Look outside." I hesitated, then drew back the curtains. Across the street, a black van idled with tinted windows. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt its gaze. My heart raced. I called the police again, but they said without evidence, their hands were tied. The neighborhood felt different. Friendly smiles turned cold, and eyes avoided mine. I sensed whispers behind closed doors. I didn't know if they were about me or if I was just projecting my terror onto everything. On Thursday, I found a note slipped under my door. No signature, just 3 words, "I'm inside you." I tore the paper into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet, but I knew it wasn't just a message. It was a declaration. I told a few coworkers, but they laughed it off, blaming stress or paranoia. I wasn't crazy, I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. But no one believed me. I started walking home different routes, taking crowded buses and changing my schedule. Still, the van appeared. The messages kept coming. My sense of safety had vanished. By Friday, I realized the real terror wasn't the intrusions or the notes, it was the fact that I couldn't trust anyone. Not the police, not my neighbors, maybe not even myself. Whoever this was had gotten under my skin, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to shake them off. That was just the beginning. The days after that first weekend were a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. I barely left the apartment except to go to work, and even then, I took circuitous routes through packed streets, avoiding any alleyways or shortcuts I once considered routine. I told myself it was precaution, but inside, I was unraveling. I'd never felt so exposed in a place I'd always thought of as safe. On Saturday morning, The first thing I did was check every lock on my apartment door, deadbolt, chain latch, the sliding bolt I'd never used before. All secured. I paced around the room, scanning every inch for anything out of place, but nothing stood out. The curtains were still drawn tight, the windows locked. The black van was nowhere in sight. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I hesitated a second before opening it. You can't hide. I slammed the phone onto the table. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I was alone in the apartment, yet I felt watched. The paranoia clawed at me, making every shadow a potential threat. I called the police again. This time, I was desperate enough to ask for a welfare check, or better yet, some kind of surveillance. The woman on the line sounded sympathetic but told me that without concrete evidence, no intruder caught, no video footage, they couldn't do much. If you see the van again, get a license plate, she said. Anything like that helps. I promised I would, though I knew it was wishful thinking. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, wiping surfaces, rearranging furniture, anything to reclaim some control. The unease didn't lift. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards made me jump. Every car door slamming outside sent my heart racing. By evening, I was so wound up I barely ate, washing down the small meal I forced myself to prepare with lukewarm water. My phone buzzed again. Why are you so scared? No number displayed. Just a message. I didn't respond. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as dusk settled. One by one, the neighbors' windows lit up, but the faces behind them remained hidden. I felt the distance between me and the rest of the world stretch wider, a chasm growing with every message, every unshakable feeling of being hunted. The night was restless, but I managed to doze off around 3 a.m., only to be jolted awake by a sharp knocking on the door. I sat up, heart hammering, listening. The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps, then silence. I reached for my book again, the same one I'd grabbed the night the door was open. I slipped out of bed quietly, eyes fixed on the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away and called the police. By the time they arrived, the knocking had stopped. They searched the hall, found no one, and left me again with reassurances that didn't reach me. That Sunday, I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Monday brought work, but I found it hard to focus. My coworkers noticed. I smiled weakly when they asked if I was okay. Mostly, I wanted to disappear. That evening, I walked home in a group of people, trying to feel safe in numbers. The black van was lurking again, parked several blocks away this time. I caught a glimpse of a dark figure inside, but when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to snap a photo, but my hands shook too much. Back inside, my phone dinged. You can't run. That night, I barely slept. The thin walls of the apartment seemed to close in, every groan and creak amplified. I thought I heard footsteps in the hall, whispers just beyond my door. I checked my locks obsessively. Tuesday morning, I woke to find the deadbolt unlocked. I hadn't touched it. My hands were steady when I checked before bed. Panic consumed me. I called the police immediately, but by the time they came, everything was locked again. The officers exchanged looks, sympathetic but helpless. If someone's messing with your locks, it's harassment, one said. We can file a report, but without catching them, there's little we can do. I filed the report anyway. That day, I started documenting everything, the messages, the sightings, the unlocked door. I saved texts, took photos, wrote down times and details. It was a feeble attempt to build a case, to prove I wasn't imagining things. Wednesday was worse. I found a note taped to the inside of my mailbox. "We see you." The handwriting was messy, jagged, as if whoever wrote it was angry or rushed. I ripped the note off, but the message echoed in my mind. I was being watched. Not by a ghost or a monster, but by a human being. Someone who wanted to control me, to break me. I started sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Thursday, I dared to tell my closest friend, Sarah. Her initial reaction was disbelief. "Are you sure you're not just stressed?" But when I showed her the messages, the notes, the photos, her expression changed. "We need to call the police again," she said firmly. Together, we went to the station. For once, the officer on duty listened. They took my phone and printed out the messages. They agreed to put a patrol car near my apartment during the night. That night, for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. But it didn't last. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. "Look outside." I swallowed hard and pulled back the curtains. Across the street, parked under a street lamp, the black van sat with its engine off. The tinted windows reflected the light, but I could see a figure sitting behind the wheel, staring directly at me. I locked the curtains quickly and backed away. The next morning, I found my bike in the hallway, damaged, the tires slashed. Someone was sending a message. Someone was here, and they weren't going anywhere. I realized then that I couldn't run, and I couldn't hide. What was happening wasn't random. It was targeted. Personal. I didn't know who wanted to terrorize me, or why, but I knew one thing: it was a game to them, and I was their unwilling player. And the worst part? I had no idea how to win. The following days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and dread. The police presence was there, in a way, but fleeting and ineffective. The patrol car cruised past my building a few times at night, but it did nothing to stop the black van from appearing whenever it wanted. By now, the van had become a symbol, a constant reminder that I wasn't safe. I caught glimpses of it parked just out of view, or idling near the corner, waiting. And every time, the feeling that I was the only one watching, the only one vulnerable, grew heavier. Friday afternoon, after work, I decided to step outside for the first real breath of air I'd allowed myself in days. Sarah had insisted I get out, even if only for a little while, and I agreed on the condition that she come with me. We walked the streets, careful and alert, our eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. Sarah tried to make conversation, but it was awkward, her usual lightheartedness dulled by the tension hanging between us. As we passed the corner store, I caught a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass door. A figure standing just across the street, half hidden behind a lamppost. The black van was nowhere in sight, but my skin prickled. The figure didn't move for a long moment, just stood there watching us. When I blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Sarah nodded, her face tight. "Yeah." We hurried home, the unease settling in my bones like a cold fog. Back inside, I checked every lock once more: deadbolt, chain latch, sliding bolt. Locked tight. I pulled the curtains closed, double-checked the windows. The apartment was supposed to be my sanctuary, but it felt more like a cage. That night, my phone buzzed again. The number was still unknown. "Why are you still here?" My hands shook as I stared at the message. Why? Why couldn't they just leave me alone? I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, anything, but I was trapped in this nightmare. Sleep was impossible. I sat on the edge of the bed, the knife still under my pillow, fingers gripping the handle like a lifeline. At 1:43 a.m., a soft knock came from the balcony door. 3 slow raps, deliberate, taunting. I froze, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The knocking stopped. I called Sarah. She stayed on the phone with me until dawn, her voice calm, steady. But the fear didn't fade. Saturday morning, I found something else waiting for me. A small package had been slipped under my door. No return address, no name, just a plain brown box taped shut. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a trap? A threat? Or something worse? I called the police before touching it. They came quickly, their faces serious now. The officers put on gloves, carefully examined the package. Inside, wrapped in plain paper, was a single photo. It was me. The image was taken from across the street, from a distance, but clear enough to see my face as I stood on my balcony the night before, phone in hand, eyes wide with fear. "How long have they been watching you?" the officer asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. The police took the photo as evidence and promised to increase patrols. But I could tell they were stretched thin, unsure how to catch someone so careful, so meticulous. The sense of being hunted deepened. I no longer went outside alone. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers. I kept my phone on silent, tucked away, afraid that any notification could be another message, another threat. Sunday was worse. The black van showed up again, idling across the street as if daring me to look. The driver's window slid down slowly, and I caught a glimpse of a man's face, sharp features, cold eyes locked onto mine. I blinked, and the van sped away, disappearing into the maze of streets. I locked myself inside the apartment, windows closed, curtains drawn tight. Monday came, and so did the silence. But it was the kind of silence that screamed. No messages. No knocks. No sightings. At first, I felt relief, but it was shallow and fleeting. I knew better. The calm meant nothing. That night, I stayed up, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind. At 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed once more. "Come outside." I didn't respond. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to play their game anymore. But something deep inside me stirred a flicker of defiance, a desperate need to take back control. The next day, I told Sarah everything. Not just the messages and sightings, but the fears, the isolation, the way it was consuming me. "We have to fight back," she said firmly. And so we did. I started carrying pepper spray, even inside the apartment, and Sarah stayed over as much as possible. I changed my routine, varying my routes, avoiding familiar places. We set up a camera in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was doing this. Days passed with nothing. Then, late Thursday night, the camera picked up movement. A shadow, a figure, crouching near my door. The officers were called immediately. They arrived within minutes, but the figure was gone. They found footprints outside, muddy and fresh. For the first time, the threat felt real, tangible. Not a faceless specter. Not a shadow. A person. Someone close enough to reach me. Someone who wasn't done. That night, sleep finally eluded me completely. I sat in the dark, clutching the knife, listening to the silence that felt anything but safe. The game was far from over. And I was running out of moves. The next morning, I woke to a dull ache behind my eyes and an emptiness in my chest that no amount of coffee or deep breaths could fix. The sun was already high, filtering weakly through the drawn curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the room. I lay still for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for it to crack. But nothing came, not a knock, not a message, not the rattling of the black van outside. I forced myself up and moved like a machine, going through the motions of getting ready for the day, shower, brush teeth, change clothes. Each step felt heavier than the last, like gravity was stronger today, or maybe it was just the weight of the fear settling into my bones. I wasn't sure if this was what exhaustion looked like, physical, mental, emotional, all tangled up inside me. Sarah called right on schedule. "Hey," she said, voice cautious but warm. "I'm okay," I lied, forcing a smile I hoped she could hear over the phone. "I think." "Good. Listen, I talked to my brother last night. He's a cop, patrol division, nothing fancy, but he's good. Said he might swing by later, take a look around, see if there's anything off you might have missed." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to pretend I was okay on my own, but the other part, the part that still hoped for some semblance of safety, said yes. "Okay. Tell him thanks. I appreciate it." After we hung up, I paced the apartment, eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. The idea of someone coming here, even someone Sarah trusted, felt strange and invasive. But maybe that was what I needed. Someone else to see this nightmare from the outside, to help me find a way out. Around noon, I heard the buzz of the intercom. "Delivery," the voice said. I froze. They weren't supposed to know I was home. "Just a package," the delivery man said through the speaker. "I need you to buzz me in." I glanced at the door, heart thudding. The delivery man didn't know what the package was, or who it was from, but still, how did they know? I pressed the button reluctantly. The door buzzed open, and a few moments later, there was a knock. I opened it just enough to slide the box inside. No one was there. Again, no return address. Just my name, neatly printed on the top. I placed the box on the kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. The thought of opening it filled me with dread, but the uncertainty was worse. I called Sarah. "Don't open it," she said immediately. "Wait for your brother. Let him check it out." I agreed and locked the door behind me as I went back to the living room. I paced again, this time more aggressively, my fingers twitching with nervous energy. Every time I glanced at the box, I flinched. Around 3 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. This time, it was Sarah's brother, Mark. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked worn but kind. "Hey," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I brought some gloves and the kit. Let's see what we've got." We moved to the kitchen table. I pointed at the box. Mark nodded and put on latex gloves. Slowly, methodically, he cut the tape, peeled back the layers. Inside was a small, weathered envelope. He pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was a crudely drawn map, streets marked with X's, arrows, and a circle around my apartment building. I swallowed hard. "What the hell is this?" I asked quietly. Mark shook his head. "Looks like someone's been tracking your movements, maybe planning something." I felt bile rise in my throat. "Do you think it's the same guy? The one from the black van?" "Hard to say." Mark frowned. "But whoever it is, they're organized. That's not random." He took photos of the map, then carefully bagged it as evidence. "I'm going to drop this at the station and talk to some detectives I know," he said. "Try to see if there's anything similar on file." I nodded, grateful, but the lump in my chest didn't budge. That evening, Sarah stayed over. We sat on the couch, silent mostly, the kind of silence that wasn't comfortable but necessary. I wanted to ask her if she thought this was ever going to end. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. Later that night, sleep was again impossible. Every creak, every distant siren felt like a threat. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the door. I held my breath, listening. They stopped, then retreated. I peeked through the peephole. No one there. But someone had been. The next morning, I called Mark. He told me the map didn't match any known suspects, but that a few recent break-ins nearby had a similar pattern: people watching, testing security systems, learning routines. "Maybe it's escalating," he said. "Someone's getting bolder." I swallowed the lump of fear that was quickly becoming part of me. Days passed with little incident. No messages, no knocks, no sightings. It felt like a reprieve. But I knew better. One night, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating softly on the nightstand. I reached for it, heart racing. A new message. "Look outside. Now." I hesitated. I wanted to ignore it. But something in me, some desperate flicker of defiance, pushed me. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The street was empty. But on the sidewalk, illuminated by the flickering street lamp, was a single red rose. My breath caught. I wanted to run, to scream, to disappear. But instead, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin. I crouched and picked up the rose, its petals soft and fragrant despite the late hour. There was a note attached. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It read, "You can't hide forever." I stood up slowly, heart hammering. From across the street, a figure emerged, stepping out of the shadows. The black van was parked a few yards away, engine idling quietly. The man's face was deep in shadow, but I recognized him: sharp features, cold eyes. My lungs tightened. "Why?" I whispered, voice barely audible. He said nothing. Slowly, he turned and walked back to the van. The engine revved, and the van disappeared into the night. I was left alone on the sidewalk, clutching the rose, the note, and the raw, cold realization that this wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about survival. And if I wanted to live, I had to stop running. I had to confront him. But how? Because he was everywhere and nowhere. And I was still the only one who saw him. The game was far from over. But now, I was ready to play. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I sat on the edge of the bed, the rose pressed to my chest, its scent oddly comforting and yet terrifying all at once. Sarah had tried to stay calm, tried to talk me through it, but when I showed her the note, her face went pale. I didn't blame her. It was a message that didn't leave room for misunderstanding. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was telling me he could reach me anytime, anywhere, and that hiding was useless. By morning, my resolve had solidified into something sharper, colder. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding behind locked doors and hopeful prayers. Mark was still digging. He promised to check in with detectives, see if they had any leads on this van or the man, and I had to do something in the meantime. But what? I felt like a mouse trapped in a maze built by a predator who knew every turn. Sarah insisted I stay with her for a few days. "You're not safe alone," she said, but I shook my head. As much as I wanted to believe that was true, I needed to face this on my own terms. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The morning after the rose, I went back to my apartment to gather a few things: papers, my phone charger, some clothes. I had to prepare for the possibility that I'd have to leave at a moment's notice. That's when I noticed it. A small scratch on the door frame, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was deliberate. Not random damage or wear and tear. Someone had marked it, like a tally or a warning. I ran my finger over it, heart pounding. How long had it been there? Had I missed it when I was too frantic to notice anything? I took photos and sent them to Mark. This isn't just about stalking anymore. Someone's marking their territory. He replied quickly, I'll bring this to the station. See if anyone's familiar with the symbol or tactic. I hadn't told Sarah about the scratch yet. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But inside, the fear was growing, twisting into something raw and urgent. Over the next 2 days, I stayed vigilant. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow looked like him. The black van hadn't appeared again, but I was sure it was only a matter of time. Then, on the 3rd day, Mark showed up with news. I checked with the local precinct, he said, face grim. No hits on the van. But there have been similar incidents, break-ins, threats across the city. Small, targeted. The difference is, most victims didn't give warnings or notes. You're being toyed with. Why me? I asked, voice barely a whisper. No one knows, he admitted. But whoever this is, they're methodical. They want you scared. They want control. The idea that this was a game to him, a twisted exercise in power, made my skin crawl. Mark suggested I get a security system installed, cameras, alarms, the works. I agreed, even though I hated the idea of cameras watching my every move, of my life being that exposed. That night, with the new system set up, I felt a flicker of security for the first time in weeks. The cameras had night vision, motion detection, direct feed to my phone and to Mark's. It wasn't foolproof, but it was something. I kept the rose on the kitchen table, a reminder and a warning. Days passed. The van didn't return. The notes stopped. The knocks ceased. It felt like a reprieve, but I knew better. I wasn't the first to be stalked. I'd read about people in the news who'd gone through this, some escaped, some didn't. One afternoon, while watching the live feed from my phone, I saw movement outside my building. A figure walking slowly, deliberately past the camera's view. I froze. The feed caught the glint of a watch on the wrist, a black jacket sleeve. The same man. The stalker. I called Mark immediately. Stay put, he said. I'm on my way. But as I waited, heart pounding, the figure stopped just outside the camera's range. Then, out of nowhere, a second figure appeared. They exchanged a brief conversation, something I couldn't hear, then the first walked away. I felt the weight of those moments. 2 people. He wasn't acting alone. Mark arrived within minutes, but by then, the figures were gone. We reviewed the footage again and again, but the second person remained anonymous, just a shadow, a presence I couldn't identify. What do we do now? I asked, voice cracking. Mark shook his head. We keep watching, keep documenting. And we prepare for the possibility that this is bigger than one man. I felt the panic rising, but I forced it down. I had to be strong. For myself, for Sarah, for anyone who might be caught in the crossfire. That night, I barely slept. The security system pinged 3 times with motion alerts, but each time, it was either a stray cat or a gust of wind. But just before dawn, I heard a sound, a faint tapping at my window. I grabbed my phone, heart in my throat, and switched on the camera feed. Nothing. I pulled back the curtain cautiously. There, lying on the fire escape, was a small box. I didn't touch it. Instead, I called Mark. By the time he arrived, the box was already cold. Gloved, He opened it carefully. Inside was a smartphone, screen cracked but still functional. There was a single message on the screen. I see you. Always. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room. But I didn't. Because I knew then, more than ever, that this was no longer just stalking. This was war. And I was the unwilling battlefield. Mark looked at me, eyes dark with concern. We need to get you somewhere safe, he said. But I shook my head. This ends here. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let him win. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something new, a fierce, burning defiance. The fight was far from over. But now, I was ready. To face him. To uncover the truth. To survive. And maybe, just maybe, to take back my life.